Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin tonight's journey into the darkness, I'm curious to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Perhaps you're in a quiet bedroom in Denver as midnight approaches, or maybe you're driving through the empty streets of Portland at 3 in the morning. Wherever you are, whatever hour has brought you here, you've found your way to the right place for stories that live in the shadows between sleep and wakefulness. Tonight, we're going to explore the darker corners of 2025, a year that has brought us technological marvels and urban sprawl, but also new ways for darkness to find us. These are not stories from history books or newspaper archives. These are the stories that exist in the spaces where modern life meets ancient fears, where the familiar becomes foreign, and where the line between reality and nightmare grows thin. So, settle in wherever you are, whatever time your clock shows, and let me take you to a place called Millbrook Heights, a suburban development that was completed just last year, where every house looks almost exactly like every other house, and where something has gone very, very wrong. The first thing you need to understand about Millbrook Heights is that it was designed to be perfect. Every curve of every street was calculated by algorithms that promised optimal traffic flow and maximum property values. The Homeowners Association guidelines ran to 400 pages, specifying everything from the exact shade of beige allowed for exterior paint to the precise height of mailbox posts. Even the trees were selected by committee, a uniform mix of Bradford pears and red maples that would provide identical canopies of shade by the year 2030. Sarah Chun moved into 47 Willowbrook Lane on a Tuesday in March 2025. She was 28 years old, a software engineer who worked remotely for a company based in Austin. She had saved for 3 years to afford the down payment on the house, drawn by the promise of safety and community that Millbrook Heights represented. The marketing materials had emphasized security above all else. Every entrance to the development was gated. Every street was monitored by cameras that fed into a central security office staffed 24 hours a day. The crime rate in Millbrook Heights was 0, the sales brochures proudly proclaimed, and they had the statistics to prove it. Sarah's house was a colonial revival, 3 bedrooms and 2.5 baths, with a 2-car garage and a small backyard that faced the community. Walking trail. It was identical to 47 other houses in the development, differing only in minor details like the color of the front door and the arrangement of shrubs in the foundation plantings. Sarah had chosen a deep blue door, thinking it would help her remember which house was hers when she came home late from evening walks or grocery runs. That the move-in process was seamless. The previous owners had left the house spotless, and all of Sarah's possessions fit easily into the space. She arranged her furniture according to the feng shui principles her grandmother had taught her, positioning her desk to face the window so she could see the morning sun while she worked, and placing a small jade plant on the kitchen windowsill for prosperity. By the end of her first week, everything felt perfectly in place. It was on her 8th night in the house that Sarah first noticed the walking schedule. She had been working late, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code, when she heard footsteps on the sidewalk outside. This wasn't unusual in itself. The walking trail was popular with residents who wanted to get their exercise in after work. But what caught Sarah's attention was the regularity of the sound. The footsteps had a mechanical precision to them, each step hitting the pavement at exactly the same interval, maintaining precisely the same pace for the entire time they were audible. Sarah glanced at her computer screen to check the time. It was 11:47 p.m. She made a mental note of it and returned to her work. 20 minutes later, she heard the footsteps again, following the exact same rhythm, lasting for exactly the same duration. She looked up from her screen and moved to the window, but the street lamps created pools of light separated by deep shadows, and she couldn't make out who was walking with such metronomic precision so late at night. The next evening, Sarah found herself waiting for the sound. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, the footsteps began. She had positioned herself at the living room window this time, with the lights off so she wouldn't be visible from the street. The footsteps approached from the direction of the main entrance to the development, passed directly in front of her house, and continued toward the cul-de-sac at the end of Willowbrook Lane. The walker moved through the pools of lamplight like a shadow, never quite visible, never quite clear. Sarah could make out the basic human shape, tall and thin, but the details remained frustratingly indistinct. At 12:07 p.m., the footsteps returned, following the same route in reverse, maintaining the same mechanical pace. Sarah counted the steps under her breath and realized that the walker was covering exactly the same distance each night, turning around at precisely the same spot, returning at precisely the same time. On the third night, Sarah decided to investigate. She put on dark clothing and waited by her front door. At 11:45 p.m., she slipped outside and positioned herself behind the large oak tree that stood at the corner of her property. The night air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of the Bradford pears that were beginning to bud. She could hear the distant hum of the highway that bordered the eastern edge of the development, but otherwise, Millbrook Heights was silent. At 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began. Sarah pressed herself against the oak tree and held her breath as the figure approached. In the dim light from the nearest street lamp, she could see that the walker was wearing dark clothes and appeared to be of average height and build. But there was something wrong with the way the figure moved. The steps were too regular, too precise, like a person walking to the beat of a metronome that only they could hear. And there was something else, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. With an instinctive revulsion, she couldn't quite identify Dot as the figure passed directly in front of her hiding spot. Sarah caught a glimpse of its face. What she saw made her stomach lurch. The figure appeared to be wearing some kind of mask, but it wasn't a Halloween mask or a ski mask or anything that made immediate sense. It looked almost like a human face, but wrong somehow, as if someone had taken a photograph of a person's features and stretched them slightly out of proportion. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, the overall effect uncanny in a way that triggered every primitive alarm bell in Sarah's nervous system. Asterisk. The figure continued past her hiding spot without pausing, maintaining that mechanical pace, heading toward the end of the street. Sarah waited until the footsteps faded before she crept back to her house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She locked the front door and checked it twice, then went to every window in the house to make sure they were all securely latched. At 12:07 a.m., the footsteps returned, passing by her house again with that same horrible precision. Sarah stood in her darkened living room, not daring to approach the window, listening to the sound fade as the figure made its way back toward the main entrance of the development. She didn't sleep that night, and she found herself checking the locks on her doors and windows compulsively until dawn. The next day, Sarah tried to put the incident out of her mind. She told herself that it was probably just a neighbor with insomnia who had developed a walking routine. The mask was probably just a trick of light and shadow, her imagination filling in details that weren't really there. But she couldn't shake the memory of those stretched features, or the mechanical precision of those footsteps. That evening, she decided to reach out to her neighbors. She had met the couple who lived next door when she first moved in, Tom and Linda Morrison, who seemed friendly enough, if somewhat formal. Sarah walked over to their house around 7 p.m. and rang the doorbell. Linda answered, greeting Sarah with a smile that seemed just a little too bright. "Sarah, how nice to see you. How are you settling in?" "Pretty well, thanks. I was wondering if I could ask you about something. Have you noticed anyone walking around the neighborhood late at night? Around midnight?" Linda's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Sarah almost missed it. "Walking? No, I can't say that I have. Of course, we're usually asleep by 10:30. Tom has to be at work early. Why do you ask?" I've heard footsteps outside my window the last few nights, very regular, like someone taking a late walk. I was just curious if you knew who it might be. Asterisk, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, Linda said, her smile returning to full brightness. Millbrook Heights is very safe. The security here is excellent. I'm sure whoever it is just likes to get some exercise before bed. Some people are night owls, you know. Sarah nodded and thanked Linda for her time, but as she walked back to her own house, she noticed something that bothered her. Linda had answered the question about the late-night walker very quickly, almost as if she had been expecting it. And there had been something in her tone, a forced casualness that suggested she knew more than she was saying. That night, Sarah positioned herself at the window again, this time with her phone ready to record video. At 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began, and Sarah started recording. But when she played the video back, the street appeared empty. The sound of the footsteps was clearly audible on the recording, but there was no visible figure to account for them. Sarah watched the video 3 times, thinking that maybe the darkness was hiding the walker from her phone's camera, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the pools of lamplight, and the sound of precise, mechanical footsteps. Fear crept up Sarah's spine like ice water. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing or not seeing. Maybe her phone's camera wasn't sensitive enough to pick up a figure in dark clothing against the shadowy street. Maybe the street lamps were creating some kind of optical illusion. But the explanation felt thin, and the wrongness of the situation pressed against her consciousness like a weight. The next morning, Sarah decided to do some research. She spent her lunch break online, looking up information about Millbrook Heights and the land it was built on. What she found made her increasingly uneasy. The development had been built on what was previously a small family farm owned by the Delacroix family for 4 generations. The farm had been sold to the development company in 2023 after the last member of the family, an elderly man named Henry Delacroix, had died under mysterious circumstances. According to the newspaper report Sarah found, Henry Delacroix had been found dead in his farmhouse by a neighbor who had come to check on him. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but what made the case unusual was the condition of the house. According to the police report, every room in the house had been methodically destroyed. Furniture was overturned, walls were damaged, and personal belongings were scattered everywhere. But nothing had been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. The police had concluded that Henry had destroyed his own house in some kind of psychotic episode before his death, though they could find no history of mental illness in his medical records. The more Sarah read about Henry Delacroix, the more disturbed she became. Neighbors described him as a quiet, solitary man who had lived alone on the farm since his wife died in 2019. But in the months before his death, several people reported that his behavior had become increasingly strange. He had started walking the perimeter of his property at night, following the same route at the same time every evening. People who lived on the road that bordered his farm said they could set their clocks by his walks. He would appear at exactly 11:47 p.m. every night and walk for exactly 20 minutes before returning to his house. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she read this. The timing was identical to the footsteps she had been hearing outside her window. She kept reading, hoping to find some rational explanation, some detail that would make the connection seem like a coincidence. What she found instead was worse. According to the police report, Henry Delacroix's body had been found in the exact spot where Sarah's house now stood. The farmhouse had been demolished to make way for the development, but the foundation had been left intact and incorporated into the basement of the new house. Sarah was living directly on top of the place where Henry Delacroix had died. That afternoon, Sarah called the development company's customer service line. She explained that she was a new resident and wanted to know more about the history of the land. The customer service representative was polite but unhelpful, directing her to a bland, corporate website that contained only generic information about the development's amenities and construction timeline. When Sarah asked specifically about the Delacroix farm, the representative claimed to have no knowledge of the previous use of the land. Sarah tried calling the local historical society, but they were equally unhelpful. The woman who answered the phone seemed nervous when Sarah mentioned Henry Delacroix and claimed that all records related to the farm had been lost in a computer crash the previous year. She suggested that Sarah contact the county records office, but when Sarah called them, she was told that the records had been sealed as part of a legal settlement between the Delacroix State and the development company. Frustrated and increasingly frightened, Sarah decided to try a different approach. She drove to the public library and spent several hours going through old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of Henry Delacroix or unusual incidents on his farm. What she found painted a disturbing picture. Over the years, there had been several reports of strange incidents on or near the Delacroix property. In 2018, a jogger had reported seeing a figure walking the perimeter of the farm at night, but when police investigated, they found no one there. In 2020, a couple driving past the farm late at night had called police to report seeing someone walking in the fields, but again, no one was found. The reports all described the same thing: a tall, thin figure walking with mechanical precision, always at the same time, always following the same route. But the most disturbing report was from 2021, just 2 years before Henry's death. A family driving home from a late dinner had stopped their car near the farm because they thought they had seen someone collapse on the road. When they got out to help, they found no one there, but all 3 family members reported hearing footsteps approaching their car. The footsteps had circled their vehicle several times before moving away, but they never saw who or what was making the sound. The police report noted that all 3 family members appeared genuinely terrified and were consistent in their descriptions, but no physical evidence was found. Sarah left the library feeling sick to her stomach. The pattern was clear, and it all connected to the land that Millbrook Heights was built on. But she still didn't understand what was happening or why the footsteps had started appearing on her street specifically. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to wait by the window. Instead, she sat in her bedroom with the lights off, listening for the sound she had come to dread. At 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began, but this time they sounded different. Instead of passing by her house, they seemed to stop directly in front of it. Sarah held her breath and listened as the footsteps moved from the street onto her front walkway. The sound of feet on concrete was replaced by the sound of feet on her wooden front porch. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized that whatever was making those sounds was standing directly outside her front door. She heard the sound of knocking, 3 precise raps that echoed through the house. Sarah remained perfectly still, not daring to breathe. After a moment, the knocking came again, 3 raps with exactly the same spacing and intensity as the first. Then silence. Sarah waited, straining to hear any sound that would indicate the presence had moved away, but there was nothing. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, Sarah crept to her bedroom window and peered out. At the front of her house, the porch was empty and the street was silent. But as she watched, she saw something that made her stomach drop. On the concrete walkway leading to her front door, there were wet footprints, as if someone had been walking through puddles. But it hadn't rained in 3 days, and there were no puddles anywhere in the neighborhood. The footprints led from the street to her front door, then back to the street, but they didn't continue down the sidewalk. They simply ended at the edge of her property, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. Sarah didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in her living room with all the lights on, checking and rechecking the locks on her doors and windows. Every small sound made her jump, and she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work. She couldn't concentrate on code when she was barely able to concentrate on staying upright. Instead, she spent the day researching everything she could find about Henry Delacroix, ghosts, hauntings, and anything else that might explain what was happening to her. What she learned didn't make her feel any better. According to several sources, people who die in states of extreme distress or obsessive behavior sometimes leave behind what researchers called residual hauntings. These weren't intelligent spirits trying to communicate with the living, but rather psychic imprints left behind by repetitive actions or intense emotions. The theory was that if someone performed the same action over and over again, especially in a heightened emotional state, they could leave behind an echo of that behavior that would repeat indefinitely. The description fit Henry Delacroix perfectly. He had walked the same route at the same time every night for months before his death, and according to the police report, he had been in an extremely disturbed mental state. If the theories were correct, he might have left behind an imprint of his nightly walks, a ghost that would continue to follow his route regardless of what had been built on the land. But that didn't explain why the presence had started coming to her door, or why the footsteps seemed to be getting stronger and more focused. According to everything Sarah read, residual hauntings were supposed to be like recordings, endlessly repeating the same actions without any awareness of their surroundings. They weren't supposed to interact with the living world or change their behavior over time. That afternoon, Sarah decided to try talking to her other neighbors. She walked to the house directly across the street, where a young couple named David and Jessica Chin lived. Sarah had met them briefly during her move-in, and they had seemed friendly and approachable. Jessica answered the door with a baby on her hip, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. She greeted Sarah warmly and invited her in for coffee. The house was identical to Sarah's in layout, but felt completely different, filled with the cheerful chaos of new parents. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, and the coffee table was covered with baby bottles and burp cloths. "I wanted to ask you about something," Sarah said after they had settled on the couch with their coffee. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood lately? Any strange sounds or people you don't recognize?" Jessica's expression grew serious. "Actually, yes, we've been hearing footsteps outside at night. Always at the same time, always the same pattern. It started about 2 weeks ago. David thinks it's just someone who works a late shift and likes to walk when they get home. But there's something about it that bothers me. It sounds so mechanical, you know, like a robot or something." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "What time do you hear the footsteps?" "Just before midnight. Maybe 11:45 or 11:50. They go by our house and then come back about 20 minutes later. The baby usually sleeps through it, but it wakes me up every time. There's something about the sound that just sets my teeth on edge." "Have you seen who it is?" Jessica shook her head. "I looked out the window a few times, but I can never see anyone. It's weird, because the footsteps are so loud and clear, but there's never anyone visible on the street. David says I'm being paranoid, but I know what I'm hearing." Sarah spent another hour talking with Jessica, sharing what she had observed and learned about Henry Delacroix. Jessica listened with growing alarm, occasionally glancing down at her baby with a protective expression. "What do you think we should do?" Jessica asked. "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "I've been trying to research it, but most of what I find sounds like nonsense. I'm thinking about contacting someone who specializes in this kind of thing, maybe a paranormal investigator or something. Would you let me know what you find out? I want to keep Emma safe, and if there's something dangerous going on in the neighborhood, I need to know about it." Sarah promised to stay in touch and walked back to her own house feeling slightly better. At least she wasn't the only one experiencing the phenomenon. But her relief was short-lived. because that night, the situation escalated again. At 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began as usual, but this time they were accompanied by another sound, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone dragging a stick along the ground. Sarah listened from her bedroom as the sounds approached her house, and she realized with horror that the tapping was coming from her windows. Something was moving along the side of her house, tapping against the glass of each window as it passed. Sarah grabbed her phone and called 911. The dispatcher listened patiently as Sarah explained about the footsteps and the tapping on her windows. But when Sarah mentioned that she couldn't see anyone outside, the dispatcher's tone became noticeably more skeptical. "Ma'am, are you sure there's someone outside your house right now?" Sarah crept to her bedroom window and peered out. The street was empty, but she could still hear the tapping moving along the back of her house toward the kitchen windows. "I can hear them, but I can't see them," she said, knowing how crazy it sounded. "We'll send an officer to check the area," the dispatcher said in a tone that suggested she thought Sarah was either delusional or making a prank call. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of Sarah's house. She watched from her window as a single officer got out and walked around the property with a flashlight, checking the yard and the perimeter of the house. He spent about 10 minutes on his investigation before returning to his car and driving away. The next morning, Sarah called the police station to ask about the officer's report. She was told that no evidence of trespassing or vandalism had been found and that the officer had noted the call as a possible false alarm. When Sarah asked if she could speak to the officer who had responded, she was told that he was off duty and unavailable. Frustrated and frightened, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She spent her lunch break shopping for security equipment, purchasing motion-activated cameras, floodlights, and a digital recorder that she could set up to capture evidence of whatever was happening outside her house. That evening, Sarah installed the cameras at strategic points around her property and positioned the digital recorder on her front porch. If something was really happening, she would have proof. If she was losing her mind, at least she would know for certain. At 11:47 p.m., Sarah sat in her darkened living room with her laptop open, watching the feeds from her security cameras. At first, everything appeared normal. The cameras showed empty views of her front yard, backyard, and the sides of her house. But then the footsteps began, and Sarah watched her laptop screen in horror. The audio from the cameras clearly picked up the sound of footsteps, but the video showed nothing. Sarah could hear the mechanical precision of the walking, could hear the footsteps move from the street onto her property, but there was no visible figure to account for the sounds. It was as if an invisible person was walking around her house, and the cameras were faithfully recording the audio, while completely failing to capture any visual evidence. But then Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. As the invisible presence moved around her house, the motion-activated floodlights were turning on and off, responding to something that the cameras couldn't see. The lights followed a path that corresponded exactly with the sound of the footsteps, creating a trail of illumination that tracked the movement of something that cast no shadow and left no visible trace. Sarah watched her laptop screen as the lights traced a complete circuit around her house, turning on and off in sequence as the invisible presence moved past each sensor. The pattern was deliberate and methodical, as if whatever was out there was deliberately triggering the lights, studying her house from every angle. The circuit took exactly 20 minutes, just like the original walking pattern that Sarah had first observed. But when the presence reached the front of the house again, instead of continuing back to the street, the footsteps stopped at her front door. Sarah heard 3 precise knocks, and she watched her front porch camera as the motion light activated, illuminating empty doorway. Sarah remained perfectly still, not daring to make a sound. After a few moments, she heard the footsteps move away from her door and back toward the street, where they faded into silence. The motion lights turned off one by one, leaving her property in darkness once again. Sarah spent the rest of the night reviewing the camera footage and the audio from her digital recorder. Everything was there: the footsteps, the timing, the pattern of the lights, the knocking at her door. But there was no visual evidence of what was causing any of it. She had proof that something was happening, but no proof of what that something was. The next day, Sarah contacted a paranormal investigation group she had found online. The group was based about an hour away from Millbrook Heights, and they agreed to come out that evening to investigate. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment as she explained the situation to the lead investigator, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patricia Winters, who had a PhD in psychology and claimed to have been studying unexplained phenomena for over 20 years. Asterisk, what you're describing sounds consistent with a residual haunting, Dr. Winters said as she and her team set up their equipment in Sarah's living room. These types of manifestations are typically harmless, but they can be very distressing for the people who experience them. The fact that the activity seems to be intensifying suggests that something about your presence here might be affecting the phenomenon. What do you mean? Sometimes residual hauntings can be strengthened by the emotional energy of living people. If you've been frightened or stressed by the activity, that emotional energy might be feeding into the manifestation, making it stronger and more noticeable. It's also possible that the construction of this house disrupted whatever psychic imprint was left behind, causing it to become more active. Asterisk, Dr. Winters and her team spent the evening setting up additional cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, temperature sensors, and audio recording equipment throughout Sarah's house and yard. Sarah was impressed by their professional approach and the scientific nature of their equipment, but she remained skeptical that they would be able to capture anything that her own cameras had missed. At 11:47 p.m., the team gathered in Sarah's living room to monitor their equipment. Sarah sat with them, watching the various displays and meters, waiting for something to happen. When the footsteps began, the results were immediate and dramatic. Every electromagnetic field detector in the house began to spike simultaneously, registering readings that were far higher than anything Dr. Winters said she had ever seen. The temperature sensors showed a drop of nearly 15 degrees throughout the house, as if something was drawing heat out of the air. The audio equipment picked up not just the footsteps, but other sounds as well, a low humming noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and what sounded like whispered words in a language none of them could identify. But most disturbing of all was what happened to the video cameras. As the invisible presence moved around the house, the cameras began to malfunction one by one. The images became distorted, showing strange shadows and shapes that shifted and moved independently of any light source. Some cameras showed what appeared to be a tall, thin figure, but the image was so distorted and fragmentary that it was impossible to make out any details. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Winters whispered as she watched the readings on her equipment. "I've never seen electromagnetic spikes this high. Whatever is causing this phenomenon has an enormous amount of energy associated with it." The investigation continued for 3 hours, during which time the team documented temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, and audio recordings of sounds that had no identifiable source. But the most significant discovery came when Dr. Winters reviewed the video footage from the cameras that had malfunctioned. Using specialized software to enhance and stabilize the distorted images, Dr. Winters was able to extract several frames that showed a more coherent picture of the presence that was haunting Sarah's house. What they saw confirmed Sarah's worst fears about what she had glimpsed that first night behind the oak tree. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the face that made everyone in the room fall silent. The features were human in basic structure, but they were wrong in subtle ways that created an overwhelming sense of uncanny valley revulsion. The eyes were too large and too bright, the mouth was too wide, and the overall proportions were slightly stretched, as if someone had taken a human face and distorted it just enough to make it deeply disturbing to look at. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Winters studied the enhanced images for a long time before answering. "I've seen residual hauntings before, but nothing like this. Most residual manifestations are very faint, barely noticeable except as brief glimpses or sounds. This has far too much energy and too much apparent awareness to be a simple psychic imprint. I think we might be dealing with something more complex." "What do you mean?" "I think Henry Delacroix didn't just leave behind an imprint of his behavior when he died. I think his death was so traumatic and his mental state was so disturbed that he left behind a fragment of his actual consciousness. What you're experiencing isn't just a recording of his nightly walks. It's a piece of his mind, trapped in the pattern of behavior that consumed his final months." The implications of this theory were terrifying. If Dr. Winters was right, then the presence haunting Sarah's house wasn't just a harmless echo of the past. It was a conscious entity, aware of its surroundings and capable of changing its behavior. That would explain why the manifestation had grown stronger over time, why it had started approaching Sarah's door, and why it seemed to be studying her house with increasing intensity. "What should I do?" Sarah asked. "I need to do more research before I can give you any recommendations," Dr. Winters said. "I want to look into Henry Delacroix's background more thoroughly, and I need to consult with some colleagues who specialize in cases like this. In the meantime, I'd suggest staying somewhere else if possible. If this entity is becoming more active and more aware, there's no telling what it might do next." Sarah nodded, already planning to call her sister and ask if she could stay at her apartment for a few days. But as Dr. Winters and her team packed up their equipment, Sarah couldn't help feeling that leaving would only be a temporary solution. Whatever Henry Delacroix had become, it was tied to this house, to the land where he had died. Running away might keep her safe in the short term, but it wouldn't resolve the underlying problem. That night, Sarah packed a bag and drove to her sister's apartment in the city. She spent 3 days there, trying to focus on work and pretend that everything was normal, but she couldn't stop thinking about the house in Millbrook Heights. She called Dr. Winters every day for updates, but the paranormal investigators' research was taking longer than expected. On the 4th day, Sarah received a call that changed everything. It was Jessica Chun, her neighbor from across the street, and she was barely coherent with panic. "Sarah, you have to come back. Something's happened. The thing, whatever it is, it's not just at your house anymore. It's been going to other houses in the neighborhood, and last night it tried to get into our house. It was turning the doorknob, Sarah. I could see it turning from the inside, but there was nobody there." Sarah's blood ran cold. If the entity was expanding its territory, then her running away might have made the problem worse, not better. "Did you call the police?" "They came out, but they couldn't find anything. Just like with you. But I know what I saw. The doorknob was turning, and I could hear footsteps on the porch, but when the police arrived, there was nothing there. David thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know what happened." "I'm coming back," Sarah said. "Don't be alone in the house tonight. Go stay with family or friends until I get there." Sarah drove back to Millbrook Heights that afternoon, her mind racing with possibilities. If the entity was no longer confined to her property, then the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. She needed to find Dr. Winters and get answers before whatever Henry Delacroix had become hurt someone. When Sarah pulled into her driveway, she immediately noticed that something was different. Her front door was standing slightly ajar, even though she was certain she had locked it when she left. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the door and trying to decide what to do. She was afraid to go into the house alone, but she was also afraid to call the police and be dismissed again as a hysterical woman seeing things that weren't there. Finally, Sarah called Dr. Winters and explained the situation. The paranormal investigator agreed to meet her at the house within the hour, and Sarah waited in her car until the van with the investigation team pulled up behind her. "The door was locked when you left?" Dr. Winters asked as they approached the house. "Definitely. I remember checking it twice." Dr. Winters examined the door frame and lock mechanism, but found no signs of forced entry. The door had simply been opened from the inside, as if someone with a key had unlocked it and failed to close it properly. The team entered the house cautiously, with Dr. Winters leading the way and the others following with cameras and detection equipment. The house felt different to Sarah, colder and more oppressive than she remembered. There was a smell in the air, faint but unpleasant, like damp earth mixed with something organic and decaying. In the living room, they found the first sign of intrusion. Sarah's furniture had been moved, not dramatically, but just enough to be noticeable. Her couch was turned at a slight angle to face the window. Her coffee table had been pushed several inches to the left. The arrangement was subtle but deliberate, as if someone had been rearranging the room to suit their preferences. In the kitchen, they found more evidence of the entity's presence. The chairs around Sarah's dining table had been pulled out and positioned in a perfect circle, as if for a meeting. In the center of the table was a small pile of dirt, arranged in a neat mound about 6 inches high. The dirt looked fresh, as if it had been recently dug from somewhere outside. Dr. Winters photographed everything before carefully collecting a sample of the dirt for analysis. As she worked, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench with dread. On the kitchen counter, someone had arranged her coffee mugs in a precise line, each one turned so that the handle pointed in exactly the same direction. But what made the display so disturbing was that there were 7 mugs in the line, and Sarah only owned 6. Where did the 7th mug come from? Dr. Winters asked when Sarah pointed out the discrepancy. Sarah examined the extra mug closely. It was white ceramic with a simple design, similar to her own mugs but subtly different. The handle was slightly thicker, and the rim was a different shape. Most unsettling of all, the mug was filled with water that had an oily, iridescent sheen on its surface. "I've never seen this mug before in my life," Sarah said. "It's not mine." Dr. Winters carefully photographed the mug before sealing it in an evidence bag. The water inside had a strange organic smell that reminded Sarah of pond water mixed with something medicinal. She made a mental note to have it analyzed as soon as possible. The team continued their examination of the house, finding more subtle signs of intrusion in every room. In Sarah's bedroom, the covers on her bed had been pulled back and the pillows arranged in a perfect line against the headboard. In her home office, papers on her desk had been sorted into neat stacks according to some incomprehensible system. Every room showed evidence that something had been there, moving through her personal space with methodical precision. But the most disturbing discovery was in the basement. Sarah rarely went down there, using the space mainly for storage and the washer and dryer. But when Dr. Winters opened the basement door, they were hit with a wave of that same organic, earthy smell they had noticed upstairs, only much stronger. Basement was darker than Sarah remembered, even with all the lights on. In the corner where she kept her Christmas decorations and old furniture, someone had created what could only be described as a shrine. Sarah's stored belongings had been arranged in a careful pattern around a central space where more dirt had been piled into a mound about 3 feet high. Sticking out of the dirt were various objects that Sarah didn't recognize: pieces of rusted metal, fragments of pottery, and what looked like old farming tools. "This is where Henry Delacroix's farmhouse foundation was," Dr. Winters said quietly. "The developer left the original foundation intact and built your house on top of it. This dirt, these objects, they're probably from the original farmhouse." Sarah stared at the bizarre shrine, trying to understand what she was seeing. "You think the entity brought these things here?" I think Henry Delacroix is trying to recreate his original environment. The farmhouse was destroyed when this development was built, and his consciousness is trapped in a pattern of behavior from when he was alive. He's trying to make the space familiar again, trying to bring back pieces of the world he knew. The implications were deeply disturbing. If the entity was capable of manifesting physical objects and moving through solid barriers, then Sarah's house wasn't just haunted, it was actively being transformed by a presence that didn't recognize the reality of the modern world built on top of its former home. Dr. Winters spent another hour documenting the basement shrine before the team packed up their equipment. As they prepared to leave, she pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. I've been researching Henry Delacroix's background, and I found some information that I think you need to know. His death wasn't as straightforward as the police reports suggested. I spoke to the neighbor who found his body, and she told me some things that weren't included in the official investigation. What kind of things? Henry had been talking about visitors in the weeks before he died. He told several people that strangers had been coming to his property at night, walking around his house and looking in his windows. He called the police multiple times, but they never found any evidence of trespassing. The neighbors thought he was developing dementia or paranoid delusions. Sarah felt a chill of recognition, the same thing that's happening to me. Exactly. But here's the disturbing part. The neighbor who found Henry's body said that when she arrived at the farmhouse, she could hear footsteps inside the house, even though Henry was already dead. She assumed someone else was in there, possibly the person who had killed him, so she called the police and waited outside. But when the officers searched the house, they found no one else there. Just Henry's body and the destroyed furniture. So the footsteps started before he died? That's what it sounds like. I think Henry Delacroix was experiencing the same phenomenon that you are, but from the other side. Something was visiting him, just like something is visiting you. The difference is that when Henry died, instead of the manifestations stopping, they got stronger. His death added his own consciousness to whatever was already there. The theory was terrifying in its implications. If Dr. Winters was right, then the entity haunting Sarah's house wasn't just Henry Delacroix. It was Henry Delacroix plus whatever had been haunting him before his death. The phenomenon was layered, with each death and each traumatic event adding another element to the manifestation. What do you think was visiting Henry before he died? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I'm going to research the history of that land going back as far as I can. If there's a pattern of unexplained deaths or supernatural activity on that property, I need to know about it. Dr. Winters promised to contact Sarah as soon as she learned anything new, and the investigation team left Sarah alone in her house. But as soon as they were gone, Sarah realized she couldn't stay there. The knowledge that the entity was capable of manifesting physical objects and entering the house at will made her feel completely vulnerable. She packed another bag and drove back to her sister's apartment, planning to stay there until Dr. Winters could provide more answers, but the entity had other plans. That night, as Sarah lay in her sister's guest bed trying to sleep, she heard a familiar sound drifting through the window from the street below. Mechanical, precise footsteps, following the same rhythm she had learned to dread. Sarah bolted upright and looked out the window, but the street was empty. Yet the sound continued, circling the building where her sister lived, as if the entity had followed her to her new location. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Dr. Winters, waking the paranormal investigator from a deep sleep. "It's here," Sarah whispered into the phone. "It followed me. I can hear the footsteps outside my sister's building." "That should be impossible," Dr. Winters said, instantly alert. "Residual hauntings are tied to specific locations. They don't follow people." Then, what am I hearing? Dr. Winters was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you're dealing with isn't a residual haunting. It's something much more dangerous. The entity has formed an attachment to you specifically, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. What does it want? I think it wants you to come home, to the house, to the place where Henry Delacroix died. I think it's trying to recreate the circumstances that led to his death, and you're playing the role that Henry played in the original scenario. Asterisk, the footsteps outside grew louder, and Sarah heard her sister stirring in the next room. She couldn't let this thing terrorize her family, couldn't let it spread beyond the boundaries of Millbrook Heights. I have to go back, don't I? I think you do, but not alone. I'm going to call in some help, people who specialize in dealing with malevolent entities. We're going to end this tomorrow night, one way or another. Sarah hung up the phone and listened to the footsteps fade as they moved away from the building. She spent the rest of the night awake, staring out the window and planning what might be her final return to 47 Willowbrook Lane. The next evening, Dr. Winters arrived at Sarah's house with a team of 5 specialists, each carrying equipment that Sarah had never seen before. There were electromagnetic field generators, devices that looked like modified radio transmitters, and several large batteries that Dr. Winters explained were needed to power their more experimental equipment. What we're going to attempt tonight is called a forced dispersal, Dr. Winters explained as the team set up their equipment throughout the house. We're going to flood this entire property with so much electromagnetic energy that any psychic manifestation should be unable to maintain coherence. It's risky, because if the entity is as powerful as I think it is, the dispersal might cause it to become violent before it dissipates. What if it doesn't work? Then we'll try a containment ritual. We'll attempt to bind the entity to a specific object that we can then remove from the property. But I have to warn you, containment rituals are dangerous for everyone involved. If something goes wrong, the entity could become permanently anchored to our physical plane, which would make it much more dangerous than it already is. Sarah nodded, trying to appear braver than she felt. She had reached the point where any action seemed preferable to continuing to live in fear of the nightly visits and the gradual invasion of her home. As the sun set, the team made their final preparations. Sarah was positioned in the living room, with a camera and instructions to document everything she observed. The specialists threaded throughout the house, each monitoring different aspects of the electromagnetic field. They were about to generate. At 11:30 p.m., Dr. Winters gave the signal to begin. The electromagnetic field generators hummed to life, filling the house with a low vibration that Sarah could feel in her bones. The lights throughout the house began to flicker, and the temperature dropped noticeably. At 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began, but they sounded different this time. Instead of the mechanical precision Sarah had grown accustomed to, the steps were irregular and stumbling, as if the entity was having difficulty maintaining its usual pattern. The electromagnetic interference was working, disrupting the manifestation's ability to function normally. Asterisk, asterisk. But as the footsteps approached the house, something went wrong. Instead of becoming weaker, the entity seemed to draw strength from the electromagnetic field, using the energy to become more solid and more visible than ever before. Sarah watched through her camera viewfinder as a tall, dark figure materialized on her front porch, no longer the shadowy, indistinct presence she had glimpsed before. The figure was unmistakably Henry Delacroix, but transformed by death and rage into something monstrous. His face was gaunt and pale, with eyes that burned with an inner light. His clothing hung in tatters, and his hands ended in fingers that were too long and too sharp. When he turned to look directly at the camera, Sarah saw that his mouth was open in a silent scream that revealed teeth like broken glass. The entity raised one impossibly elongated hand and pressed it against the front door. Sarah watched in horror as the wood began to splinter and crack under the pressure, the doorframe warping as if the house itself was being reshaped by the entity's will. "It's not working," Dr. Winters shouted over the increasing hum of the electromagnetic generators. "It's using our energy to become stronger. Shut it down." Sarah yelled back, but it was too late. The front door exploded inward, sending splinters of wood flying across the living room. The entity stepped through the destroyed doorway, bringing with it a wave of freezing air and the overpowering smell of grave earth. Henry Delacreo looked around, the living room with eyes that held no trace of human sanity. His gaze fixed on Sarah, and she saw something in his expression that made her understand the true nature of what was happening. This wasn't just a ghost seeking to recreate his former life. This was a consciousness that had been driven beyond the boundaries of reason by the circumstances of his death, and it blamed the living world for what had been taken from him. The entity moved towards Sarah with that same mechanical precision she had observed in his footsteps. But now she could see the hate that drove the movement, the consuming need for revenge against a world that had forgotten him. Dr. Winters and her team were shouting instructions to each other, trying to recalibrate their equipment to contain the manifestation. But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that they were beyond the point where technology could help them die. As Henry Delacroix reached out toward her with those impossibly long fingers, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Instead of running or screaming, she stood up and looked directly into the entity's burning eyes. "I know what happened to you," she said quietly. "I know about the visitors who came to your farm, about the footsteps you heard at night, about the fear you lived with before you died. You weren't crazy, were you? There really was something haunting you, just like you're haunting me now." The entity stopped moving, its outstretched hand frozen inches from Sarah's face. For the first time since the manifestation had begun, the mechanical precision of its movements faltered. In its eyes, Sarah saw a flicker of the man Henry Delacroix had once been, before terror and death had transformed him into this twisted reflection of human consciousness. "You're trapped in the same pattern that destroyed you when you were alive," Sarah continued. "You experienced what I'm experiencing now, and it drove you to madness and death. But instead of ending the cycle, your death just added another layer to it. Now you're the one creating the footsteps, the one visiting houses at night, the one driving people to the edge of sanity." The entity's form began to waver, becoming less solid as Sarah's words penetrated whatever remained of its rational mind. The burning light in its eyes dimmed, and for a moment, Sarah could see the confusion and pain that lay beneath the rage. "I don't know who or what was haunting you before you died," Sarah said. "But I know that you have a choice now. You can keep repeating the same pattern, becoming the monster that was created by the monster that haunted you, or you can break the cycle. You can choose to be different." The entity looked around the destroyed living room, taking in the shattered doorframe and the scattered equipment of Dr. Winters' team. When its gaze returned to Sarah, she saw something that gave her hope, recognition. Henry Delacroix was remembering what it felt like to be human, to be afraid, to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. Slowly, the entity lowered its outstretched hand. The burning light in its eyes faded, and its elongated fingers returned to normal human proportions. The freezing air that had accompanied its manifestation began to warm, and the oppressive weight that had filled the house lifted slightly. "I was so afraid," the entity said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Every night, the footsteps, the eyes watching from the darkness. I couldn't make it stop. I couldn't make them leave me alone." "I know," Sarah said. "I know exactly how you felt. But now you have the power to make it stop. You can choose not to pass that fear on to anyone else." The entity looked down at its hands, as if seeing them clearly for the first time since its death. When it looked up again, its face had returned to fully human proportions, and Sarah could see the man Henry Delacreo had been, frightened, lonely, driven to desperation by forces he couldn't understand or control. "I don't know how to stop," he said. "The pattern, the walking, the need to find someone who understands what happened to me. I can't remember how to be anything else. Dr. Winters stepped forward carefully, her equipment still humming, but no longer generating the painful electromagnetic interference. Henry, my name is Dr. Winters. I've been researching what happened to you, trying to understand the forces that led to your death. I think I can help you find peace, but you have to let go of the anger and the need for revenge. The entity turned to look at Dr. Winters, and Sarah saw hope flicker in its eyes. You know about the others? The ones who came before me? I know that the land your farm was built on has a history of unexplained deaths and supernatural activity going back over a century. I think you became caught in a cycle that has been repeating for generations, and your death added your own consciousness to the pattern. But that doesn't mean you have to remain trapped in it forever. Dr. Winters approached Henry carefully, holding out a small object that looked like a crystal wrapped in silver wire. This is a focusing stone. If you're willing, you can transfer your consciousness into it voluntarily. Once you're contained, I can take you somewhere safe, somewhere far from this land where you can find the peace that was denied to you in life. Henry looked at the stone with longing and fear. What about the others? The ones who haunted me, who drove me to madness? If I leave, will they find someone else to torment? That's a risk we'll have to take, Dr. Winters said. But by choosing to break the cycle yourself, you might weaken their hold on this place. You might make it possible for future residents to live here in peace. Sarah watched as Henry struggled with the decision. She could see the part of him that wanted to cling to existence, even the tormented existence he had known since his death. But she could also see his recognition of the pain he had caused her and her neighbors, the understanding that he had become the very thing that had destroyed his own life. Finally, Henry reached out and touched the focusing stone. As soon as his fingers made contact with the crystal, his form began to dissolve, becoming a stream of light that flowed into the stone. The crystal grew brighter and brighter until Sarah had to shield her eyes, and then suddenly, everything was quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the house was gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the smell of grave earth faded away. Dr. Winters held up the focusing stone, which now pulsed with a gentle, steady light. Is he really in there? Sarah asked. His consciousness is contained within the stone, yes. He'll be aware but at peace, no longer driven by the compulsions and fears that trapped him in the cycle of haunting. I'll take him to a place where he can exist safely without causing harm to anyone. Sarah looked around her destroyed living room and felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The nightly footsteps were gone. The mechanical precision of supernatural dread had been broken, and she could finally imagine sleeping peacefully in her own bed. But as Dr. Winters and her team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the problem hadn't been completely solved. Henry Delacroix had been contained, but he had also confirmed that there were other entities associated with the land, older presences that had been driving the cycle of supernatural activity for generations. What if they come back? Sarah asked, as Dr. Winters prepared to leave with the focusing stone. What if whatever was haunting Henry before his death decides to start the cycle again with someone else? Dr. Winters paused at the door, considering the question. It's possible. The land that Millbrook Heights was built on has a long history of supernatural activity, and removing Henry from the equation might not be enough to end it completely. But you've shown that the cycle can be broken, that people can choose to respond differently when confronted with the supernatural. That knowledge might be enough to protect future residents. After Dr. Winters and her team left, Sarah spent the rest of the night cleaning up the debris from her destroyed front door and trying to process what had happened. She felt exhausted but relieved, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. The next morning, Sarah called a carpenter to repair her front door and contacted her homeowner's insurance to report the damage. She told them that the door had been damaged during a break-in attempt, which was technically true if you considered supernatural manifestation a form of breaking and entering. Over the following weeks, life in Millbrook Heights slowly returned to normal. The nightly footsteps stopped, and Sarah's neighbors reported that they no longer heard the mechanical walking that had disturbed their sleep. Jessica Chun called to thank Sarah for her role in ending the haunting, and even the Morrison couple from next door seemed friendlier and more relaxed than they had been before. But Sarah couldn't completely let go of her concern about the older entities that Henry had mentioned. She continued to research the history of the land, and what she found disturbed her. The supernatural activity associated with the property seemed to follow a pattern, with clusters of unexplained deaths and strange incidents occurring roughly every 30 to 40 years. The most recent cluster had been in the 1980s, when a family named the Weatherbys had lived on the land that was now part of Millbrook Heights. According to newspaper reports, the Weatherby family had experienced a series of increasingly strange incidents: objects moving on their own, sounds with no identifiable source, and family members reporting dreams that seemed too vivid and consistent to be mere products of imagination. The incidents had culminated in the death of the father, Robert Weatherby, who had been found dead in his barn under circumstances that the coroner had been unable to explain. His body showed no signs of injury or illness, but witnesses reported that he had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death, talking about visitors who came to the farm at night and claiming that something was trying to communicate with him through his dreams. Before the Weatherbys, there had been the Kowalski family in the 1940s, and before them the original settlers who had first cleared the land in the 1890s. In each case, the pattern was similar: strange incidents, increasingly erratic behavior from at least one family member, and eventual death under mysterious circumstances. Sarah began to suspect that Henry Delacroix's haunting of her house had been just the most recent iteration of a cycle that had been playing out for over a century. Each generation of inhabitants had faced the same supernatural forces, and each had responded in their own way. Some had fled, some had tried to fight back, and some had been destroyed by what they encountered. The difference was that Sarah had been able to break the cycle, not through violence or flight, but through understanding and compassion. She had recognized Henry Delacroix's humanity even after death had transformed him into something monstrous, and that recognition had allowed him to remember his own capacity for choice. But Sarah also understood that her success might have been due partly to luck and partly to the specific circumstances of her situation. She had been dealing with Henry Delacroix's spirit, which still retained enough human consciousness to be reasoned with. The older entities that had driven the original cycle might be far less receptive to human appeals for mercy. As the months passed, Sarah settled into a routine of cautious normalcy. She worked from home, maintained her house and yard, and gradually became more involved in the Millbrook Heights community. She joined the Homeowners Association and volunteered for neighborhood events, partly because she enjoyed the social interaction and partly because she wanted to stay informed about any unusual incidents that might indicate a return of supernatural activity. For almost a year, everything remained quiet. Sarah began to hope that the removal of Henry Delacroix's spirit had been enough to end the cycle permanently. But in the spring of 2026, she began to notice subtle signs that something was changing. The first sign was the behavior of the neighborhood animals. Dogs that had previously been friendly and social became nervous and aggressive, barking at empty air and refusing to walk along certain sections of the community trail. Cats disappeared from their usual outdoor haunts, and several residents reported finding dead birds in their yards, always arranged in neat rows as if placed there deliberately. The second sign was the dreams. Sarah started hearing from neighbors who reported having unusually vivid and disturbing dreams, often featuring themes of being watched or followed by unseen presences. The dreams were consistent enough in their details that Sarah began to suspect they weren't entirely natural, But the most troubling sign was the discovery of new artifacts buried around the development. Construction workers who had been hired to install additional lighting along the walking trail reported finding strange objects buried in the soil. Fragments of old pottery, pieces of rusted metal, and carved stones that appeared to be much older than anything that should have been associated with the relatively recent farming use of the land. Sarah arranged to examine some of these artifacts, and what she found confirmed her worst fears. The objects were clearly much older than the 19th century. Settlement of the area, possibly dating back centuries or even millennia. They appeared to be ritual objects of some kind, carved with symbols that didn't match any known native American or European traditions. The implication was clear. The supernatural activity associated with the land didn't begin with the first European settlers. It predated them by centuries, possibly millennia, originating with whatever indigenous peoples had first recognized the area as a place of power and significance. Sarah realized that she was dealing with something far more ancient and complex than she had originally understood. Henry Delacroix's haunting had been just the most recent layer of a supernatural phenomenon that had roots stretching back to the very beginning of human habitation in the area. The land that Millbrook Heights was built on was what researchers in the paranormal field called a thin place, a location where the barrier between the physical world and other planes of existence was naturally weak. Such places tended to accumulate supernatural activity over time, with each generation of human inhabitants adding their own layer to the accumulated psychic energy of the site. Armed with this new understanding, Sarah contacted Dr. Winters and arranged for another investigation of the development. This time, the paranormal investigator brought equipment specifically designed to detect the kind of ancient, multi-layered manifestations that were associated with thin places. The results of the second investigation were both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Winter's instruments detected multiple layers of psychic energy associated with the land, stretching back over what appeared to be several thousand years. The oldest layer was so ancient and alien that her equipment could barely register it, but the more recent layers told a clear story of human settlement, conflict, and death. What you're living on top of, Dr. Winters explained to Sarah as they reviewed the investigation results, is essentially a psychic archaeological site. Each generation of inhabitants has left behind their own imprint, and over time, those imprints had begun to interact with each other in increasingly complex ways. Is that why the activity seems to follow a cycle? Exactly. The older entities feed off the psychic energy generated by living humans, especially humans who are experiencing fear or distress. When they have enough accumulated energy, they become strong enough to manifest physically and interact with the living world. They drive people to madness and death, which generates even more psychic energy for them to feed on. And Henry Delacroix was just the most recent victim? Henry was a victim, but he also became part of the system. When he died, his consciousness was absorbed into the older pattern, adding his own intelligence and recent memories to the ancient entity's collective knowledge. That's why his haunting was so much more sophisticated and targeted than the older manifestations. He brought human cunning to what had previously been purely instinctive supernatural behavior. The implications of Dr. Winter's findings were deeply disturbing. If the paranormal investigator was correct, then removing Henry Delacroix's spirit hadn't ended the cycle. It had simply reduced it to its previous, more primitive state. The ancient entities were still there, still feeding off the psychic energy of the development's residents, still working toward the critical mass of accumulated power that would allow them to begin manifesting physically again. How long do we have? Sarah asked. Based on the historical pattern, probably several years. The entities seem to need time to accumulate sufficient energy after each major manifestation. But the process might be accelerating now that the land has been developed and populated with so many potential victims. Sarah looked out at the neat rows of houses that made up Millbrook Heights, each one occupied by families who had no idea they were living on top of a supernatural time bomb. She thought about Jessica Chun's baby, about all the other children in the development, about the elderly residents who had moved there, seeking safety and security in their retirement years. What can we do to stop it? Dr. Winters was quiet for a long moment, studying her instruments and considering the question. Traditional methods of dealing with supernatural manifestations aren't going to work here. The entities are too old and too deeply rooted in the land to be banished or contained. But there might be another approach. What kind of approach? Instead of trying to fight the entities directly, we might be able to starve them. They feed off human psychic energy, especially negative emotions like fear and despair. If we could somehow shield the residents of the development from their influence, cut off their food supply, they might eventually weaken to the point where they can't manifest physically. The idea was intriguing but seemed almost impossibly complex to implement. How could you shield an entire residential development from supernatural influence? How could you protect hundreds of people from entities that most of them didn't even believe in? But as Sarah thought about it, she began to see possibilities. The key was understanding that the entity's power came from human fear and ignorance. If people knew what they were dealing with, if they understood the nature of the threat and felt empowered to respond to it, they might be able to resist the supernatural influence more effectively. What if we told people the truth? Sarah suggested, what if we organized the community to deal with the problem collectively? Dr. Winters looked skeptical. Most people wouldn't believe you. And even if they did, mass hysteria might actually make the problem worse by generating exactly the kind of negative psychic energy the entities feed on. Sarah considered this objection, but she wasn't ready to give up on the idea. What if we approached it differently? What if we focused on community building and positive activities, creating an atmosphere that naturally resists supernatural influence without necessarily telling people why we're doing it? The more Sarah thought about it, the more convinced she became that this was the right approach. Instead of fighting the ancient entities directly, she would build a community strong enough and positive enough to starve them of the negative energy they needed to survive. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into community organizing with an energy that surprised even her. She organized neighborhood potluck dinners, game nights, and outdoor movie screenings. She started a community garden where residents could work together to grow vegetables and flowers. She lobbied the Homeowners Association to install better lighting and security cameras, not because she thought they would be effective against supernatural threats, but because they would make residents feel safer and more secure. The results exceeded Sarah's expectations. As the sense of community in Millbrook Heights grew stronger, the subtle signs of supernatural activity began to diminish. The neighborhood animals became calmer and more social. Reports of disturbing dreams decreased. The construction workers who were still working on development improvements stopped finding strange artifacts buried in the soil. Sarah monitored the situation carefully, staying in regular contact with Dr. Winters and documenting any changes in the paranormal activity associated with the development. For over 2 years, her community building strategy seemed to be working. The ancient entities appeared to be weakening, deprived of the negative psychic energy they needed to maintain their influence over the living world. But in the summer of 2028, everything changed. A new family moved into the house at the end of Willowbrook Lane, in the spot that had previously been unoccupied since the development's construction. The new residents were the Blackwood family, parents Michael and Jennifer, and their teenage son David, who had just turned 16. From the moment they moved in, Sarah sensed that something was different about the Blackwoods. They were polite enough when introduced to their neighbors, but there was something reserved and secretive about them that made Sarah uncomfortable. Unlike other new residents, who eagerly participated in community activities and seemed grateful for the friendly welcome. The Blackwoods kept to themselves and showed little interest in becoming part of the neighborhood's social fabric. But what truly concerned Sarah was 16-year-old David Blackwood. There was something about the boy that triggered every instinct she had developed for recognizing supernatural influence. He was pale and thin, with dark hair that always looked slightly unkempt and eyes that seemed to look right through the people he was talking to. When he walked around the neighborhood, he moved with a precision and regularity that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of Henry Delacroix's mechanical footsteps. Sarah tried to dismiss her concerns as paranoia, a natural result of her traumatic experiences with the previous supernatural manifestation. But as the weeks passed, her uneasiness about David Blackwood continued to grow. Other residents began to comment on the boy's strange behavior. He was often seen walking around the development late at night, following routes that seemed to have no logical purpose. He would stand for long periods in front of other people's houses, staring at the windows as if he was trying to see inside. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday evening in September. Sarah was working late in her home office when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Footsteps on the sidewalk outside, precise and mechanical, following the exact rhythm that had haunted her 3 years earlier. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Dr. Winters, but the paranormal investigator didn't answer. She tried several more times before giving up and creeping to her window to look outside. David Blackwood was standing in the middle of the street, directly in front of her house. He was wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light from the street lamps, and his pale face was turned upward toward her window. When he saw her looking down at him, he smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp in the dim light. Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart hammering. She tried calling Dr. Winters again, and this time the paranormal investigator answered on the first ring. "Sarah, I was just about to call you. I've been monitoring the psychic energy levels at your location remotely, and something is happening. The ancient entities are becoming active again, much sooner than I expected." "There's a new family in the development," Sarah said, keeping her voice low, even though she was certain David Blackwood could somehow hear her regardless. "Their teenage son is standing outside my house right now, and he looks exactly like Henry Delacroix did when he was manifesting physically. Sarah, you need to get out of there immediately. If the entities have found a new human vessel, someone they can possess or influence directly, they'll be far more dangerous than they were when they were working through Henry's ghost." Sarah looked out the window again. David Blackwood was still standing in the street, but now he was no longer alone. Sarah could see other figures beginning to materialize around him, indistinct shapes that seemed to emerge from the shadows between the street lamps. The ancient entities were gathering their strength, preparing for a new phase of their cycle. "I can't leave," Sarah said. "If I run away, they'll turn their attention to my neighbors. All the families with children, all the people who trust me to help keep this community safe. I have to find a way to stop this here and now." Dr. Winters was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. "There might be a way, but it's extremely dangerous. If the entities are using David Blackwood as a vessel, we might be able to sever that connection before they become strong enough to manifest independently." "What would that involve? Direct psychic intervention?" "I would have to confront the entities while they're channeling through David and attempt to break their hold on him. But if something goes wrong, if they're stronger than I expect, they could take control of me as well." Sarah looked out the window again. More figures were materializing around David Blackwood, and she could see lights beginning to come on in houses throughout the development as residents sensed that something was wrong. The ancient entities were no longer trying to hide their presence. They were preparing for a full manifestation, confident that they now had enough accumulated power to overwhelm any resistance. "How long do you need to get here?" "I'm already on my way." I left as soon as my instruments detected the energy spike. But Sarah, you need to understand that this might not work. These entities are thousands of years old, and they've had decades to accumulate power since the last major manifestation. Even if we succeed in severing their connection to David, they might simply choose another vessel. Sarah ended the call and continued watching from her window. David Blackwood hadn't moved from his position in the street, but the figures surrounding him were becoming more solid and distinct. Sarah could make out tall, robed shapes that seemed to be composed partly of shadow and partly of something more substantial. Their faces, when she could glimpse them, were blank and featureless, as if they had never been fully human to begin with. As Sarah watched, David raised his arms above his head in what appeared to be a ritualistic gesture. The ancient entities responded by moving closer to him, and Sarah could see streams of darkness flowing from their forms into his body. David was serving as a conduit, allowing the entities to channel their accumulated power into the physical world. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate and dramatic. Street lamps began to flicker and dim, as if something was draining the electrical power. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Sarah could see her breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. Most disturbing of all, she could hear sounds coming from other houses, doors slamming, windows rattling, and the faint sounds of people crying out in fear or confusion. The entities were no longer focusing their influence on a single target. They were attacking the entire development simultaneously, drawing power from the fear and confusion of hundreds of residents to fuel their manifestation. Sarah grabbed her coat and headed for the front door. She couldn't wait for Dr. Winters to arrive. If the ancient entities succeeded in their full manifestation, they would be beyond the reach of any intervention the paranormal investigator could provide. As Sarah stepped out onto her front porch, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The temperature felt arctic, as if winter had arrived suddenly in the middle of September. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe, and Sarah could taste something metallic and unpleasant in the back of her throat. David Blackwood turned to look at her as she approached, and Sarah saw that his eyes were no longer entirely human. They glowed with the same inner light she had seen in Henry Delacroix's transformed face, but there was something older and more alien in David's expression. The boy's consciousness was still there, trapped behind the supernatural influence, but it was being suppressed by something vastly more powerful and malevolent. "Sarah Chen," David said in a voice that carried harmonics of multiple speakers, as if several entities were speaking through him simultaneously. "We have been waiting for you to join us." Sarah stopped about 10 feet away from the possessed boy, close enough to communicate, but far enough to run if necessary. "I'm not here to join you. I'm here to offer you a deal." The entities controlling David tilted his head with predatory interest. "What could you possibly offer us that we cannot simply take?" "Information. I know things about this land, about the cycle you've been trapped in for centuries, that you've never understood. I know why your manifestations have always been temporary, why you've never been able to establish permanent control over this location." The ancient entities conferred among themselves through David's body, and Sarah could see the boy's face contorting as multiple consciousnesses struggled for control of his vocal cords. "Speak," they finally said. "You've been approaching this wrong from the beginning. You think that generating fear and death gives you power, but it actually weakens you in the long term. Every time you drive the human inhabitants to madness and death, you create the conditions for your own temporary banishment." Sarah was making this up as she went along, drawing on her research into the historical pattern of supernatural activity and hoping that her theory would be convincing enough to keep the entities talking until Dr. Winters arrived. "The humans who die under your influence don't disappear," Sarah continued. "They become ghosts like Henry Delacroix, and eventually those ghosts challenge your authority over the land. That's why your control is always temporary. You create your own opposition." The entities seemed to consider this explanation, and Sarah could see David's face cycling through a range of expressions as different consciousnesses evaluated her words. An interesting theory, they finally said, but irrelevant. This time, we will establish permanent control by possessing multiple vessels simultaneously. Your neighbor boy is merely the first. Soon we will inhabit every resident of this development, creating an army of the living that cannot become ghosts who oppose us. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the true scope of what the entities were planning. They weren't just trying to manifest physically for another temporary reign of terror. They were planning to possess the entire population of Millbrook Heights, creating a permanent foothold in the physical world that would allow them to expand their influence beyond the boundaries of the development. That won't work either, Sarah said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Mass possession requires more energy than you have available. You'll burn through your accumulated power within days and be left weaker than before. But even as she said it, Sarah could see that the entities weren't convinced by her arguments. They had been planning this manifestation for years, possibly decades, and they were confident that they had finally accumulated enough power to succeed where their predecessors had failed. Dr. Winter's van pulled up at the end of the street, and Sarah saw the paranormal investigator and her team getting out with their equipment. But she also realized that they were too late. The ancient entities had already begun their possession of other residents. Sarah could see people emerging from houses throughout the development, all moving with the same mechanical precision that characterized David Blackwood's movements. The possessed residents began walking toward the center of the street, forming a circle around David and the manifested entities. Sarah found herself surrounded by her former neighbors, people she had worked with to build the sense of community that was supposed to protect them from exactly this kind of supernatural influence. Among the possessed residents, Sarah recognized Jessica Chun, the young mother from across the street. Jessica was carrying her baby, who was now over 2 years old and walking on her own. Both mother and child moved with the same eerie synchronization as the other possessed residents, their eyes glowing with the same alien light that burned in David Blackwood's gaze. "You see how easily they surrendered to us," the entity said through David's voice. "Your community building, your positive energy, your attempts to starve us of negative emotions, all useless against the fundamental human capacity for fear. One moment of terror was enough to open all of them to our influence." Sarah looked around at the circle of possessed residents and realized that her strategy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. She had assumed that the entities fed exclusively on negative emotions, but what they actually fed on was psychic energy of any kind. The strong community bonds she had helped create had actually made the residents more psychically open and connected, which had made them easier to possess once the entities began their assault. Dr. Winters and her team were setting up their equipment at the edge of the development, but Sarah could see that they were keeping their distance from the circle of possessed residents. The paranormal investigator had obviously realized that a direct confrontation would be futile against entities that now had access to hundreds of human vessels. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, playing for time while she tried to think of a new approach. "What we have always wanted," the entities replied. "To exist fully in the physical world, to experience sensation and emotion and life without the limitations of spiritual existence. For thousands of years we have been confined to the spaces between life and death, able to observe, but never to truly participate. Now we will live through these vessels, experiencing every aspect of human existence while retaining our accumulated knowledge and power." Sarah realized that she had been thinking about the entities wrong from the beginning. She had assumed they were malevolent spirits seeking to cause harm for its own sake, but they were actually more like refugees from some other plane of existence, desperate to experience physical life, even if it meant displacing the original consciousness of their hosts. Asterisk, this understanding gave her an idea, But it was risky and would require her to make a sacrifice that terrified her more than any supernatural threat she had faced. "I have a better offer," Sarah said. "Instead of possessing hundreds of unwilling hosts who will resist you and eventually find ways to break free, why not accept one willing host who understands what you are and what you want?" The entity's attention focused on her with laser intensity, and Sarah could feel their ancient consciousness examining her thoughts and motivations. "You would offer yourself as a vessel? I would offer to share my body with one of you voluntarily. A partnership instead of a possession. You would get to experience human life directly, and I would retain enough of my consciousness to help you navigate the complexities of the modern world." The proposal clearly intrigued the entities, but Sarah could see suspicion in David's glowing eyes. "Why would you make such an offer?" "Because I understand what it's like to be trapped in a pattern you can't escape. For 3 years, I've been living with the knowledge that this land is cursed, that the people I care about are in constant danger from forces they don't understand. If accepting one of you as a partner can free my neighbors from possession and bring some kind of peace to this place, then it's worth the risk." Sarah was being honest about her motivations, but she was also gambling that her offer would appeal to the entity's desire for willing cooperation rather than forced subjugation. If she could convince them to release the other residents and accept her as their sole vessel, she might be able to limit the damage and protect the community she had worked so hard to build. The ancient entities conferred among themselves for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, they spoke through David again. "One of us will accept your offer, but understand that once the partnership begins, it cannot be broken. You will share your existence with us for the remainder of your natural life." Sarah nodded, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "I understand, but I have conditions. You have to release all the other residents immediately, and you have to promise that you won't possess anyone else in this development as long as our partnership continues." "Agreed. But if you attempt to resist our influence or find ways to limit our access to your experiences, we will consider the agreement void and resume our original plan." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward into the center of the circle. As she approached David Blackwood, she could see the terror in the boy's eyes as his own consciousness struggled against the supernatural influence that controlled his body. "Let him go first," Sarah said. "Release David and then we'll complete the transfer." The entity seemed to consider this request, then nodded David's head in agreement. Sarah watched as the alien light faded from the boy's eyes and his mechanical posture relaxed into normal human movement. David collapsed to his knees, gasping and shaking as his own consciousness reasserted control over his body. At the same time, Sarah could see the other possessed residents beginning to stagger and look around in confusion as the entities released their hold on the neighborhood's population. The circle of people began to break up as residents realized they were standing in the middle of the street in the middle of the night, with no clear memory of how they had gotten there. "Now it's your turn," the entities said, their voice now coming from the air around Sarah rather than from any human throat. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for what was about to happen. She had no idea what it would feel like to share her consciousness with an ancient supernatural entity, or whether she would be able to maintain her sense of self once the partnership began. The initial contact was surprisingly gentle. Instead of the violent invasion she had expected, Sarah felt a presence settling into her mind like a cautious houseguest, exploring her memories and thoughts without disturbing them. The entity that had chosen to partner with her was curious rather than malevolent, fascinated by the complexity and richness of human experience. Sarah opened her eyes and realized immediately that her perception of the world had changed dramatically. She could see energy patterns that were normally invisible, streams of light connecting every living thing in the development. She could sense the emotional states of everyone around her, feeling their confusion and fear as a tangible presence in the air. But most remarkably, she could still think and act independently. The entity's presence in her mind was noticeable, but not overwhelming. It felt more like having a very knowledgeable advisor than like being possessed by an alien consciousness. "This is acceptable," Sarah said, and she realized that her voice now carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, evidence of the supernatural presence that now shared her vocal cords. The other residents of Millbrook Heights were beginning to disperse, returning to their homes with confused expressions and fragments of memories they couldn't quite piece together. Dr. Winters approached Sarah cautiously, her instruments registering the enormous amount of supernatural energy now contained within. "Sarah's body, how do you feel?" Dr. Winters asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. She could sense the ancient entity exploring her memories, learning about everything from the taste of coffee to the feeling of sunlight on human skin. The presence was alien but not hostile, more like a curious child than a malevolent spirit. "Different, but still myself," Sarah said. "I think this is going to work." Over the following months, Sarah learned to live with her supernatural partner. The entity, which eventually told her its name was something like Ethan in human language, was endlessly fascinated by human experience. It particularly enjoyed simple physical sensations, the feeling of hot water in a shower, the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of music, the texture of different fabrics. In exchange for access to human sensory experience, Ethan shared knowledge that it had accumulated over thousands of years. Sarah learned about the true history of the land that Millbrook Heights was built on, about the indigenous peoples who had first recognized it as a thin place between worlds, and about the cosmic forces that had created the conditions for supernatural activity in the first place. Sarah also discovered that her partnership with Ethan gave her abilities that she had never imagined. She could sense supernatural activity from great distances, communicate telepathically with other entities, and manipulate energy patterns in ways that allowed her to heal minor injuries and calm emotional disturbances in the people around her. These abilities made her a valuable resource for Dr. Winters' paranormal investigation team, and Sarah began working with them on cases throughout the region. She became something like a supernatural diplomat, helping to resolve conflicts between human communities and the various entities that occasionally intruded into the physical world. But Sarah's most important work remained in Millbrook Heights. With Ethan's help, she was able to create a genuinely protective atmosphere around the development, shielding the residents from supernatural influence, while maintaining the strong sense of community that had always been her goal. The other ancient entities that had been associated with the land gradually faded as their source of psychic energy was cut off. Without fear and chaos to feed on, and without unwilling human vessels to possess, they retreated to whatever dimension they had originally inhabited, leaving Sarah and Ethan as the sole supernatural presence associated with Millbrook Heights. Arrangement wasn't perfect. Sarah had to be constantly vigilant to maintain the balance between her human consciousness and Ethan's alien presence. She had to give up certain aspects of normal human life, particularly romantic relationships, because the complexity of sharing intimate, emotional bonds with another person while hosting a supernatural entity proved to be too difficult to manage. But Sarah found compensations for what she had sacrificed. Her partnership with Ethan gave her access to knowledge and experiences that no purely human person could ever have. She could perceive beauty in energy patterns that were invisible to normal sight, could understand the deep connections that linked all living things, and could communicate with forms of consciousness that existed beyond the boundaries of physical matter. Most importantly, Sarah had found a way to protect her community that didn't require violence or exile. The residents of Millbrook Heights lived safely and peacefully, unaware of the supernatural forces that had once threatened them, but benefiting from the protective presence that Sarah and Ethan maintained. Years passed, and Sarah settled into her role as the development's unofficial guardian. She continued to work remotely, maintaining her career as a software engineer, while secretly serving as a supernatural security system for her neighbors. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had moved to Millbrook Heights seeking safety and community, and had ended up providing exactly those things for everyone else. But in 2031, Sarah's carefully maintained equilibrium was disrupted by the arrival of a new resident who would challenge everything she thought. She understood about the supernatural forces she was dealing with. The new resident was a woman named Elena Vasquez, who moved into a house at the opposite end of the development from Sarah's. Elena appeared to be in her early 40s, with dark hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She moved in quietly, with very few possessions and no apparent family or friends to help her settle into the community. From the moment Elena arrived, Sarah sensed that there was something different about her. Ethan's presence in Sarah's mind became agitated whenever Elena was nearby, and Sarah found herself experiencing flashes of memories that weren't her own, images of ancient rituals, sacred spaces, and forms of knowledge that human civilization had supposedly forgotten. Sarah tried to approach Elena in the same friendly way she greeted all new residents, but the other woman was polite but distant. Elena attended community events and participated in neighborhood activities, but always as an observer rather than a full participant. She watched everything with those intense brown eyes, as if she was studying the community for some purpose that she kept to herself. The situation became more concerning when Sarah realized that Elena's presence was affecting the protective barriers that she and Ethan had established around Millbrook Heights, the supernatural shields that had kept the development safe for years were weakening, not because of any malevolent action on Elena's part, but simply because her presence interfered with the energy patterns that maintained the protection. Sarah tried to discuss the problem with Ethan, but the ancient entity became evasive whenever she brought up Elena Vasquez. The supernatural presence that had been her constant companion and advisor for 5 years suddenly seemed reluctant to share information, and Sarah began to suspect that there was more to Elena's arrival than a simple coincidence. The mystery deepened when Sarah began researching Elena's background. According to public records, Elena Vasquez had previously lived in a small town in New Mexico that had been abandoned following a series of unexplained incidents in 2030. Newspaper reports from the area described strange lights in the sky, mass hallucinations among the residents, and ultimately the complete evacuation of the town after several people died under circumstances that authorities were unable to explain. The pattern was familiar to Sarah, who had spent years studying supernatural phenomena. It sounded like Elena had been the center of some kind of supernatural incident that had destroyed her previous community, and now she had come to Millbrook Heights, possibly seeking refuge or possibly bringing whatever forces had destroyed her hometown along with her. Sarah decided to confront Elena directly, despite Ethan's growing reluctance to discuss the situation. She waited until evening and walked over to Elena's house, hoping to have a conversation that would clarify what they were dealing with. Elena answered the door before Sarah could knock, as if she had been expecting the visit. "Sarah Chun, I was wondering when you would come to see me. I think we need to talk," Sarah said, "about what happened in New Mexico and about what you're doing here." Elena smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "I'm not doing anything here, Sarah. That's exactly the problem. I'm trying very hard to do nothing at all, but I'm not sure how long I can maintain that." She invited Sarah into her house, which was sparsely furnished but filled with objects that Sarah recognized as supernatural artifacts: crystals, carved stones, and books written in languages that predated any known human writing system. The house felt like a bunker designed to contain rather than exclude supernatural forces. "You're like me," Sarah said, understanding dawning as she looked around the room. "You're hosting something." Elena nodded. "Multiple somethings, actually. I've been a vessel for supernatural entities since I was 17 years old. Unlike you, I didn't choose the arrangement. I was born with natural psychic abilities, and the entities found me before I was old enough to understand what was happening. Sarah felt Ethan stirring uneasily in her mind, and she began to understand why the ancient entity had been reluctant to discuss. Elena. The supernatural forces that Elena was hosting were apparently known to Ethan, and the relationship was not a friendly one. What kind of entities? Sarah asked. The kind that your partner has been hiding from for the past 5 years, Elena said. Ethan didn't tell you the complete truth about why the ancient entities were willing to accept your offer of partnership. They weren't just looking for willing, human hosts. They were trying to escape from something much older and more powerful than themselves. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with supernatural cold. What are you talking about? Elena gestured to the artifacts scattered around her living room. These entities I'm hosting, they're what you might call supernatural law enforcement. They hunt down rogue entities that have violated the laws governing interaction between the Viva, physical and spiritual planes. Possessing unwilling humans is one of the most serious violations possible. And Ethan? Ethan and its companions have been fugitives for centuries, hiding in this thin place and feeding off human psychic energy in violation of cosmic law. When you offered to become a willing partner, Ethan saw an opportunity to legitimize its presence in the physical world and avoid the hunters that were closing in. Sarah felt betrayed and confused. For 5 years, she had believed that her partnership with Ethan was protecting her community and providing a positive resolution to the supernatural problems that had plagued Millbrook Heights. Now Elena was telling her that she had been manipulated into providing sanctuary for a cosmic criminal. If that's true, Sarah said, then why are you telling me this now? Why didn't these hunter entities find Ethan years ago? Because Ethan's partnership with you created a form of diplomatic immunity. As long as you were a willing host and the entity wasn't causing harm to other humans, the hunters had no legal grounds for extraction. But my arrival here changes the situation. Elena explained that her role was something like a supernatural probation officer. She monitored entities that had violated cosmic law but had managed to negotiate alternative sentences to outright banishment. Ethan's case had been under her jurisdiction for years, but she had only recently been assigned to make direct contact and evaluate whether the partnership with Sarah was genuinely beneficial or merely a more sophisticated form of the same violations that had gotten Ethan in trouble in the first place. What's your assessment? Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Mixed, Elena said. Ethan has clearly benefited from experiencing human life through your partnership, and your community has been genuinely protected from supernatural threats. But Ethan has also been feeding off your psychic energy for 5 years, even if you weren't aware of it. The entity is stronger now than it was when you first made the agreement, which suggests that it's still engaging in the same basic behavior that got it classified as a rogue entity in the first place. Sarah tried to process this information while dealing with Ethan's increasingly agitated presence in her mind. She could sense the ancient entity's fear and anger, but also something that felt like genuine remorse. Ethan had never told her about its past violations or the supernatural law enforcement agencies that were hunting it, but it had also genuinely tried to honor the spirit of their partnership agreement. What happens now? Sarah asked. That depends on what you want to happen, Elena said. I have the authority to recommend several different courses of action. I could authorize the continuation of your partnership under closer supervision. I could arrange for Ethan to be transferred to a different host who is more aware of its true nature. Or I could recommend that the entity be extracted and returned to its original plane of existence. Each option had serious implications for Sarah's future. Continued partnership under supervision would mean giving up much of the independence she had maintained for the past 5 years. Transfer to a different host would mean losing the knowledge and abilities she had gained from Ethan. But it might also mean freedom from the constant presence of an alien consciousness in her mind. Extraction would mean the end of the supernatural protection she had been providing to Millbrook Heights, potentially leaving the community vulnerable to other supernatural threats. "I need time to think about this," Sarah said. Elena nodded. "Take all the time you need. But understand that my presence here is affecting the supernatural barriers around this development. The longer I stay, the weaker those protections become. Eventually, other entities will sense the vulnerability and move in to fill the vacuum." Sarah left Elena's house feeling more confused and uncertain than she had since the night she first heard Henry Delacroix's footsteps outside her window. Everything she thought she understood about her situation had been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure who or what she could trust anymore. That night, Sarah attempted to have a direct conversation with Ethan about Elena's revelations. The ancient entity was reluctant to discuss its past, but under pressure, it confirmed the basic truth of what Elena had told her. "I did not deceive you intentionally," Ethan said through Sarah's own voice, speaking aloud for the first time. "Since their partnership had begun, when we made our agreement, I believed that I could find legitimate existence through willing partnership with a human host. I did not know that such arrangements were still considered violations of cosmic law. But you knew you were a fugitive from something. I knew that there were forces that opposed my presence in the physical world. But I believed they were motivated by prejudice against entities like myself, not by legitimate concern for cosmic law. I thought I was seeking refuge from persecution, not justice." Sarah could sense the genuine confusion and regret in Ethan's mental voice. The entity had apparently convinced itself that its violations were justified by the circumstances that had led to them, and it had rationalized the partnership with Sarah as a legitimate alternative to the predatory behavior that had characterized its past. "What were the original violations?" Sarah asked. "What did you do before you came to this land?" Ethan was quiet for a long time before answering. "My kind are meant to exist as observers of the physical world, able to perceive but not to influence or experience. For millennia, I followed these restrictions, watching the rise and fall of human civilizations without interfering. But as I observed, I began to desire what I saw. I wanted to feel sunlight, to taste food, to experience the full range of sensation and emotion that defines human existence." "So you started possessing people?" "Not initially. At first, I tried to find willing hosts, humans who understood what I was offering and agreed to share their existence with me. But most humans who were capable of such arrangements were also capable of resisting my influence when they decided they no longer wanted to continue the partnership. The relationships rarely lasted more than a few months." Sarah began to understand the progression of Ethan's violations. Frustrated by the temporary nature of willing partnerships, the entity had probably gradually moved toward more coercive arrangements, eventually reaching the point where it was possessing unwilling hosts and driving them to madness and death. "The land that became Millbrook Heights was your hiding place?" "It was a thin place where I could exist between dimensions, drawing minimal energy from the human inhabitants without forming direct partnerships that might be detected by the hunters. I thought I could remain there indefinitely, taking only what I needed to maintain basic existence. But Henry Delacroix disrupted that balance. Henry was unusually sensitive to supernatural presence. He sensed me and became frightened, which drew more of my attention to him. As his fear increased, I found myself drawn more deeply into interaction with the physical world. Eventually, I crossed the threshold into direct influence, which alerted the hunters to my location." Sarah finally understood the complete pattern of supernatural activity that had plagued the land for generations. Ethan had been hiding there for over a century, occasionally interacting with sensitive humans and causing the periodic cycles of strange incidents and unexplained deaths. Henry Delacroix had simply been the most recent victim of these interactions, but his death had forced Ethan into a more direct manifestation that had attracted the attention of cosmic law enforcement. And now Elena is here to decide what happens to both of us. Elena Vasquez is fair but inflexible, Ethan said. She will recommend whatever course of action she believes best serves cosmic law, regardless of the consequences for individual entities or humans. If she determines that our partnership is still a violation, she will authorize my extraction, even if it means the end of the protection I have been providing to this community. Sarah spent the next several days agonizing over her options. She valued her partnership with Ethan and had no desire to give up the knowledge and abilities it provided. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that her relationship with the entity was built on incomplete information and possibly outright deception. More importantly, she had to consider the welfare of her community. If Elena was right about her presence, weakening the supernatural barriers around Millbrook Heights, then every day Sarah delayed her decision was another day that the residents were vulnerable to supernatural threats. The decision was made for her on a Thursday evening in early November. Sarah was working late in her home office when she sensed a massive supernatural presence approaching the development. Through her enhanced perception, she could see streams of dark energy flowing toward Millbrook Heights from multiple directions, as if several powerful entities were converging on the community simultaneously. Sarah ran outside and saw Elena emerging from her house at the same time, both of them sensing the approaching threat. But when Sarah tried to activate the protective barriers that she and Ethan had maintained for years, she found that they were too weak to repel the incoming entities. "What's happening?" Sarah called to Elena as they met in the middle of the street. "The word has gotten out that this location is vulnerable," Elena shouted back over the rising wind that accompanied the supernatural manifestation. "Every rogue entity in the region is heading here to claim territory before the hunters can establish new protections." Sarah could see the truth of Elena's statement in the energy patterns flowing around them. Dozens of supernatural entities were approaching Millbrook Heights, drawn by the weakened barriers and the promise of easy access to human psychic energy. If they succeeded in establishing themselves, the community would face supernatural threats, far worse than anything Henry Delacroix had represented. "Can you stop them?" Sarah asked. "Not alone," Elena said. "The entities I'm hosting are powerful, but they're designed for individual extractions, not mass confrontations. We need Ethan's help, but that means acknowledging its legitimacy as a protector of this territory." Sarah understood what Elena was offering. If Ethan could successfully defend Millbrook Heights against the approaching rogue entities, it would demonstrate that the partnership with Sarah was genuinely beneficial rather than simply a more sophisticated form of violation. Such a demonstration might be enough to convince the cosmic authorities to allow the arrangement to continue, but it would also mean putting both Sarah and Ethan at enormous risk. If they failed to repel the attacking entities, both of them would likely be destroyed or absorbed by the more powerful supernatural forces. Sarah felt Ethan's presence stirring in her mind, preparing for what would either be their greatest triumph or their final battle. "We're going to try," she told Elena. "I'll help as much as I can," Elena replied, her own eyes beginning to glow as the hunter entities she hosted prepared for combat. The first wave of attacking entities reached the edges of Millbrook Heights, just as Sarah and Ethan began channeling their combined power into a new set of protective barriers. But these weren't the subtle invisible shields they had maintained for years. These were blazing walls of psychic energy, visible to anyone with the slightest supernatural sensitivity as pillars of light that rose from the ground to form a protective dome over the entire development. The attacking entities crashed against Sarah's barriers like waves against a seawall, testing for weaknesses and probing for ways to penetrate the defense. Sarah could feel the enormous strain of maintaining the shields against so many simultaneous attacks, and she knew that she and Ethan couldn't sustain this level of output for more than a few minutes, but they didn't have to sustain it alone. As the supernatural battle raged around Millbrook Heights, Sarah began to sense other presences joining the defense. The residents of the development couldn't see the energy barriers or the attacking entities, but they could subconsciously feel the threat to their community, and their collective will to protect their homes was adding strength to Sarah's shields. Even more surprisingly, Sarah sensed the presence of Henry Delacroix joining the defense. The former farmer's spirit, which Dr. Winters had contained in a focusing stone years earlier, had somehow broken free of its containment and returned to defend the land where he had lived and died. His contribution to the barriers carried the desperate strength of someone fighting to protect what he loved most. The combined power of Sarah and Ethan's partnership, Elena's hunter entities, the collective psychic energy of the development's residents, and Henry Delacroix's protective spirit created a defense that the attacking entities couldn't penetrate. One by one, they gave up their assault and retreated to look for easier targets elsewhere. As the supernatural battle ended and the protective barriers settled into a new, more stable configuration, Sarah realized that the crisis had resolved. More than just the immediate threat to Millbrook Heights, the successful defense had demonstrated that her partnership with Ethan could serve cosmic law rather than violating it, and that the entity's presence in the physical world could be genuinely beneficial when properly channeled. Elena approached Sarah as the last of the attacking entities faded from the area. Her eyes had returned to normal, and she looked exhausted but satisfied. "I think I've seen enough to make my recommendation," Elena said. "Your partnership with Ethan will be allowed to continue, but with some modifications to ensure that it remains within cosmic law." Sarah felt relief flood through her body, followed immediately by curiosity about what modifications Elena had in mind. "You'll need to formalize your role as Ethan's supervisor," Elena explained. "Instead of being simply a willing host, you'll be officially designated as the entity's guardian, responsible for ensuring that it doesn't violate cosmic law in the future. You'll receive training in supernatural jurisprudence and regular visits from cosmic law enforcement to monitor the situation." Tonight's story begins in the suburban sprawl of Millbrook Heights, a development that sprang up just outside Portland in early 2024. The houses there are identical, each one a pale echo of the American dream, with their beige siding and small front yards bordered by chain-link fences. It's the kind of place where people move to disappear, to become anonymous, to start over. Sarah Chun thought it would be the perfect place to rebuild her life after her divorce, after the restraining order, after everything fell apart in San Francisco. She bought the house at 1247 Maple Grove Lane in March of 2025, paying cash from the settlement, eager to put distance between herself and her past. The house was unremarkable in every way, which was exactly what Sarah wanted. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen that opened into a living room barely large enough for a couch and television. The previous owners had left behind a few pieces of furniture, items too worthless to move, but too functional to throw away. A rickety wooden desk in the spare bedroom, a metal filing cabinet with a lock that didn't work, and in the basement, an old chest freezer that hummed constantly. A low electrical drone that became part of the house's ambient soundtrack. Sarah worked remotely as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she rarely had reason to leave the house. She ordered groceries online, conducted meetings through video calls, and found a strange comfort in the isolation. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Vasquez, lived 50 feet away, but might as well have been on another planet. They exchanged polite waves when they happened to be outside at the same time, but Sarah preferred it that way. She had learned to distrust human connection, to find peace in solitude. But houses have their own personalities, their own rhythms, and 1247 Maple Grove Lane was no different. The hardwood floors creaked in specific patterns, The pipes groaned when the water pressure changed, and every night at exactly 11:47, something in the walls would make a soft tapping sound, like fingers drumming against wood. Sarah assumed it was the house settling, old construction materials expanding and contracting with temperature changes. She had lived in enough apartments and rental houses to know that every building had its quirks. It wasn't until her third week in the house that Sarah discovered the photographs. She had been organizing the spare bedroom, the one she intended to use as her office, when she accidentally knocked over the old wooden desk. As it toppled, one of the drawers slid open, spilling its contents across the floor. Most of it was junk, the detritus left behind by previous occupants: rubber bands, paper clips, a few pens that had long since dried up. But underneath it all, scattered like fallen leaves, were dozens of photographs. They were Polaroids, the kind that had made a brief comeback in the early 2020s before digital photography fully conquered the market. The images were faded but clear enough to make out the subjects: families posing in front of Christmas trees, children blowing out birthday candles, couples embracing on beaches and in restaurants. Normal photographs, the kind that fill albums and phone galleries across the world. But as Sarah gathered them up, something about the images began to feel wrong. The people in the photographs all looked similar. Not identical, but similar enough to be unsettling. The children had the same wide-set eyes and slightly pointed chins. The adults shared a particular slope to their shoulders, a way of holding their heads that was almost imperceptible, but somehow consistent across every image. And in every photograph, without exception, every person was smiling. Not the natural, spontaneous smiles that emerge from genuine happiness, but the forced, uncomfortable smiles of people who had been told to smile and were doing their best to comply. Sarah spread the photographs across her desk and counted them. 63 images total, spanning what appeared to be several years based on the clothing and hairstyles. But here was the strangest part. Despite the apparent passage of time, none of the people in the photographs seemed to age. The children remained children. The adults remained exactly as they had been in the earliest pictures. It was as if someone had been staging the same scenes over and over again, using the same people, creating the illusion of a normal family life that existed only in these static moments. At the bottom of the pile, Sarah found a photograph that made her hands shake. It showed the living room of her house, the same living room where she now spent her evenings watching television and eating takeout dinner. But in the photograph, the room was filled with people, all of them wearing those same strained smiles, all of them looking directly at the camera with those wide-set, too familiar eyes. They were arranged around the room like mannequins, some sitting on the couch that Sarah had since replaced, others standing against the walls in poses that seemed natural but somehow single quotes T. Sarah dropped the photograph as if it had burned her fingers. She gathered up all the images, stuffed them back into the drawer, and pushed the desk against the wall. For the rest of that evening, she tried to convince herself that the photographs were simply remnants of the previous owner's life. Strange but ultimately harmless. People took odd pictures sometimes. Families had inside jokes and traditions that might seem bizarre to outsiders. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything she had seen. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the house's familiar sounds, Sarah heard something new. Footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door, soft and careful, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. She held her breath and listened, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the sounds stopped as suddenly as they had begun. When she finally found the courage to open her bedroom door and look out, the hallway was empty and dark. The next morning, Sarah convinced herself that the footsteps had been part of a dream, a manifestation of her anxiety about the photographs, and the general stress of moving to a new place. She had always been prone to vivid dreams, especially during periods of change in her life. The rational explanation was always the right one, she reminded herself. There were no mysteries, only information she didn't yet have. She decided to learn more about the house's history. A few hours of online research revealed that 1247 Maple Grove Lane had been built in 1987 and had changed hands 6 times since then. The turnover rate seemed unusually high for a relatively new house in a decent neighborhood. But Sarah found reasonable explanations for most of the sales: job relocations, divorces, deaths in the family. The kind of life events that force people to uproot themselves and start over somewhere else. The most recent previous owners had been David and Linda Morrison, who had purchased the house in January of 2023 and sold it just 14 months later. The real estate listing from their sale described the house as being in excellent condition, recently updated with new appliances and fresh paint throughout. But when Sarah looked more closely at the listing photos, she noticed something odd. In every image of the interior, there were signs that the house had been hastily prepared for sale. Rectangles of slightly different colored paint on the walls where pictures had recently been removed. Clean spots on carpets where furniture had obviously stood for years. Closets that were completely empty in a way that suggested everything had been removed quickly and without care. Sarah tried to find contact information for the Morrisons, thinking she might ask them about the photographs, but her searches turned up nothing. It was as if David and Linda Morrison had simply vanished after selling the house, leaving no forwarding address, no social media presence, no trace of their continued existence anywhere online. This wasn't necessarily unusual, Sarah knew. Some people valued their privacy, especially after going through whatever circumstances had forced them to sell their home so quickly. Asterisk. But the absence of any information about the Morrisons began to feel ominous, especially when combined with the photographs and the footsteps and the general sense of unease that had been growing in Sarah since she moved into the house. She found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her doors, keeping lights on throughout the night, and starting every morning with a careful walk through the house to make sure everything was exactly as she had left it. It was during one of these morning inspections that Sarah noticed the basement door was standing open. She was certain she had closed it the night before, just as she closed it every night before going to bed. The basement made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't articulate. It wasn't just the darkness or the musty smell of concrete and old wood. It was something about the space itself, the way it felt larger than it should be, the way sounds echoed strangely off the walls, the way the chest freezer in the corner hummed with what seemed like unusual intensity. Sarah stood at the top of the basement stairs, her hand on the light switch, trying to decide whether to go down and investigate or simply close the door and pretend nothing had happened. The smart thing would be to call the police, report a possible break-in, let trained professionals determine whether someone had been in her house. But what would she tell them? That she had found some old photographs and heard footsteps that might have been part of a dream. That a door she thought she had closed was now open. It sounded ridiculous even to her. Instead, Sarah descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete steps. The basement was exactly as she remembered it, mostly empty except for the water heater, the furnace, and the chest freezer that the previous owners had left behind. She had never bothered to look inside the freezer, assuming it was empty and simply hadn't been worth the effort of moving. But now, standing in the dim light of the single bare bulb that illuminated the space, Sarah found herself walking toward the appliance. The freezer was larger than she had initially realized, big enough to hold several months' worth of groceries for a large family. It was an older model, probably from the 1990s, with a heavy lid that required some effort to lift. Sarah placed her hands on the handle and pulled, expecting the usual resistance of a freezer seal. Instead, the lid opened easily, as if it had been recently used. Inside, the freezer was not empty. The first thing Sarah saw was a stack of photograph albums, the kind with plastic sleeves designed to protect images from moisture and age. There were at least a dozen albums, all of them thick with pictures, all of them carefully organized. But it was what she saw beneath the albums that made her stumble backward, knocking over a paint can that had been sitting on a nearby shelf. Clothing. Children's clothing, adult clothing, all of it neatly folded and arranged in stacks. T-shirts and jeans, sweaters and dresses, underwear and socks. The clothing appeared to be sorted by size rather than by person, as if someone had been organizing a donation to charity. But the fabric was stiff with cold, and when Sarah looked more closely, she could see dark stains on several of the items. Stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Sarah slammed the freezer lid closed and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not stopping until she was in her kitchen, with the door locked behind her. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took her 3 attempts to dial 911, and when the dispatcher answered, Sarah found herself struggling to explain what she had discovered. Asterisk, I need someone to come to my house, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I found evidence of something terrible. There are things in my basement, in the freezer, clothes with blood on them, and photographs, so many photographs. The dispatcher was calm and professional, asking for Sarah's address and assuring her that officers would be dispatched immediately. Are you in immediate danger? The woman asked. Is there anyone else in the house with you? Sarah looked around her kitchen, at the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, at the coffee mug she had left on the counter, at all the normal details of her normal life that now seemed fragile and temporary. I don't think so, she said, but I don't know. I don't know what any of this means. While she waited for the police to arrive, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and tried to process what she had seen. The rational part of her mind suggested that there might be innocent explanations for everything. The clothing could have belonged to the previous owners, people who had simply forgotten to clean out the freezer before they moved. The stains might not be blood at all, but something harmless like chocolate or dirt or rust from the freezer itself. The photographs could be family pictures that the Morrisons had stored in the basement for safekeeping. But even as she tried to rationalize what she had discovered, Sarah knew that something was deeply wrong with 1247 Maple Grove Lane. The evidence was circumstantial and confusing, but it pointed toward something terrible, something that had happened in her house before she had ever set foot in it. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 uniformed officers who listened patiently as Sarah explained about the photographs in the vial basement and the freezer full of bloody clothing. They were professional and thorough, taking notes and asking clarifying questions, but Sarah could see the skepticism in their eyes. She was a single woman living alone, someone who might be prone to anxiety and overactive imagination. They had probably responded to dozens of similar calls from people who had convinced themselves they were living in the middle of a horror movie. Asterisk Officer Martinez, a tired-looking man in his 40s, accompanied Sarah down to the basement while his partner, Officer Chun, remained upstairs to secure the scene. Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairs and pointed toward the chest freezer, but when Officer Martinez lifted the lid, he found only the hum of the cooling system and the faint smell of freezer burn. The freezer was completely empty. Are you sure this is the right appliance? Officer Martinez asked, his voice gentle but clearly doubtful. Maybe there's another freezer somewhere else in the house. Sarah stared into the empty freezer, her mind reeling. The photograph albums were gone. The stacks of stained clothing had vanished. Even the smell she remembered from earlier was completely absent. It was as if none of it had ever existed, as if she had imagined the entire experience. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. It was all here. The clothes, the pictures, everything. I saw it with my own eyes just an hour ago. Officer Martinez closed the freezer lid and made a note in his report. Sometimes when we're stressed or anxious, our minds can play tricks on us, he said. Moving to a new place, living alone, it can all contribute to feelings of unease. Have you been sleeping well lately? Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that what she had seen was real, but how could she prove something that was no longer there? The officers searched the rest of the basement and found nothing unusual. They checked the doors and windows for signs of forced entry and found none. They examined the photographs from the desk drawer, but in the daylight, surrounded by skeptical police officers, the images looked like normal family pictures, the kind that anyone might have left behind by accident. After the officers left, promising to file a report, but clearly considering the matter closed, Sarah sat alone in her house and tried to make sense of what had happened. Either she was losing her mind, or someone had entered her house while she was waiting for the police and removed all the evidence she had discovered. The first option was terrifying, but at least provided a medical explanation for her experiences. The second option was worse because it meant that someone was watching her, someone who could enter her house at will and manipulate her environment without leaving any trace. Asterisk that evening, Sarah called her sister in Seattle, desperate for someone to talk to, someone who might be able to help her think through what was happening. Jessica had always been the practical one in the family, the one who could find logical solutions to any problem. Maybe you should consider coming to stay with us for a few days, Jessica suggested after Sarah had explained about the photographs in the basement and the police visit. It sounds like you're under a lot of stress, and sometimes a change of environment can help clear your head. But Sarah knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. If she was having some kind of mental breakdown, it would follow her to Seattle. And if there really was something wrong with the house at 1247 Maple Grove Lane, someone needed to figure out what it was. Instead, Sarah decided to investigate further. She set up a camera in the basement, positioned to monitor the chest freezer. Throughout the night, she installed motion sensors near all the doors and windows, devices that would alert her phone if anyone entered the house. She even placed small pieces of tape across the basement door frame, invisible markers that would be disturbed if the door was opened. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The camera recorded hours of footage showing an empty basement with an undisturbed freezer. The motion sensors remained silent. The tape across the doorframe stayed perfectly intact. Sarah began to feel foolish, like someone who had let fear and imagination run wild in the absence of real problems. But on the 4th night, everything changed. Sarah woke at 2:30 in the morning to the sound of her phone buzzing with motion. Sensor alerts. Every sensor in the house was triggering simultaneously, indicating movement in the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, and the basement. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the basement camera feed, expecting to see nothing more than the same empty room she had been monitoring for days. Instead, she saw people. They were the same people from the photographs, the ones with the wide-set eyes and strained smiles, but now they were moving through her basement like guests at a party. Men and women and children, all of them wearing the clothes Sarah had seen in the freezer, all of them acting as if they belonged in the space. They weren't looking at the camera or acknowledging its presence in any way. They simply moved through the basement, talking to each other in voices too soft for the camera's microphone to pick up, gesturing at things Sarah couldn't see, acting out the motions of a normal social gathering. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as a woman in a blood-stained yellow dress opened the chest freezer and began removing items. More photographs, albums, pieces of jewelry, what appeared to be personal documents. She handed these things to the other people in the room, who examined them with the kind of casual interest that people might show when looking through family heirlooms. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the activity stopped. The people in the basement simply faded away, becoming transparent and then invisible, leaving behind only the empty room and the undisturbed freezer. Sarah's motion sensors went quiet, and the camera feed returned to its normal view of concrete walls and shadows. Sarah sat in her bedroom, staring at her phone screen, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. The rational explanation was that she was having some kind of psychotic break, that the stress of the divorce and the move and the isolation had finally pushed her mind beyond its breaking point. But the camera had recorded everything. She had digital evidence of what she had seen, proof that her experiences weren't just products of her imagination. She called the police again, but this time Officer Martinez's partner, Officer Chun, responded. Alone, Sarah showed her the camera footage, expecting validation, expecting someone else to see what she had recorded. But when they played back the video, it showed nothing but an empty basement, hours of footage with no movement, no people, no activity of any kind. I don't understand, Sarah said, replaying the footage over and over. They were here. I watched them for 20 minutes. They were opening the freezer, taking things out, talking to each other. Officer Chun was kind but firm. Ma'am, I think you need to consider talking to someone. A counselor or therapist, someone who can help you work through whatever you're dealing with. Living alone can be harder than people think, and sometimes our minds create experiences to fill the emptiness. After Officer Chun left, Sarah sat in her living room and stared at the walls, the same walls that had appeared in the photograph she had found in the desk drawer. She thought about the Morrisons, the previous owners who had vanished without a trace. She thought about the high turnover rate for the house, all the families who had lived there briefly before moving on. And she began to understand that whatever was happening at 1247 Maple Grove Lane had been happening for years, maybe decades, driving away one family after another, but understanding didn't make the situation any less terrifying. If anything, it made things worse because it suggested that Sarah was trapped in something much larger than her own personal crisis. The house itself seemed to be the source of the problem, a place where the boundary between past and present had somehow become permeable, where the people who had once lived there continued to exist in some form. Sarah knew she should leave, pack her belongings and drive away and never look back. But she also knew that running wouldn't solve anything for the next person who bought the house, the next family that would move in and discover the photographs and hear the footsteps and find themselves questioning their own sanity. Someone needed to figure out what had happened at 1247 Maple Grove Lane, and Sarah was beginning to realize that she might be the only person positioned to do it. The next morning, she drove to the Millbrook Heights Community Center and asked to speak with someone who had lived in the neighborhood since the development was first built. The receptionist directed her to Harold Brennan, an elderly man who had been one of the first residents and had watched the community grow from a handful of houses to the sprawling subdivision it had become. Harold was in his 70s, with the kind of precise memory that some people maintain well into their old age. He remembered when 1247 Maple Grove Lane was first constructed, remembered the young family that had moved in as the house's first occupants. The Hartmans, he said, settling into a chair in the community center's small library. Paul and Margaret, and their 3 kids. Seemed like a nice family, kept to themselves mostly. But there was something off about them from the beginning, something that made the other neighbors uncomfortable. Harold explained that the Hartmans had lived in the house for almost 2 years before they simply vanished one winter morning. No moving truck, no forwarding address, no goodbyes to neighbors or explanations to employers. They were there one day and gone the next, leaving behind a house full of furniture and personal belongings, as if they had simply evaporated. The police investigated, of course, Harold continued, but there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle or violence. It was like the family had just decided to walk away from their entire life. The bank eventually foreclosed on the house, and it sat empty for almost a year before someone bought it and cleaned it out. Sarah asked about the subsequent owners, the families who had lived in the house since the Hartmans disappeared. Harold's expression grew troubled as he recounted a pattern of brief residencies and sudden departures. Each family had stayed for a year or 2 at most before moving away. usually under circumstances that seemed rushed and unexplained. It got to the point where people in the neighborhood started to talk, Harold said. Not seriously, you understand, but the kind of talk that happens when something doesn't feel right. People would joke that the house was cursed, that something about it drove families away. But it was just talk, the kind of stories that develop around any place with a history of turnover. But Harold's expression suggested that he had never entirely dismissed those stories, that he had observed things over the years that couldn't be easily explained. He told Sarah about the lights that would sometimes be visible in the house's windows, during periods when it was supposed to be empty. The sounds of children playing in the backyard on nights when no children lived there. I always told myself it was just the neighbor's kids, he said. Sound carries in strange ways sometimes, especially at night. But there were times when I'd look out my window and swear I could see people moving around in that house. People who shouldn't have been there. Sarah left the community center with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that her experiences at 1247 Maple Grove Lane were part of a much larger pattern. The house wasn't just haunted by the Hartmans, she realized. It was haunted by all the families who had lived there, all the people who had been driven away by whatever presence inhabited the space. That evening, Sarah made a decision that she knew was dangerous but felt necessary. Instead of trying to avoid the supernatural activity in her house, she would try to communicate with it. She set up her camera again, not to document evidence for the police, but to record whatever happened when she tried to make contact with the people she had seen in the basement. At exactly 11:47, the time when she always heard the tapping in the walls, Sarah went down to the basement and stood in front of the chest freezer. She spoke to the empty air, addressing the invisible presence she felt watching her. "I know you're here," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. "I've seen you. I've seen the photographs. I know about the families who lived here before me. I want to understand what happened. I want to help." For several minutes, nothing happened. Sarah stood alone in the basement, feeling foolish and frightened, wondering if she was talking to nothing more than her own imagination. But then the temperature in the room began to drop, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The chest freezer lid opened by itself, slowly and silently, revealing the same contents Sarah had seen days earlier. The photograph albums, the stained clothing, the carefully organized remnants of lives that had been interrupted. But this time, she also saw something else. At the bottom of the freezer, underneath everything else, there were bones. Human bones, small ones that could only have belonged to children. Sarah stepped backward, her heart pounding, but forced herself to keep looking. The bones were arranged in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic, surrounded by personal items that must have belonged to the Hartman family. A child's toy, a woman's wedding ring, a man's wallet. It was a shrine of sorts, a memorial to people who had died in the house and then been forgotten by the world above. And then Sarah understood. The people she had seen in the photographs and in the camera footage weren't the spirits of the dead. They were the living people who had discovered this shrine, the families who had found the evidence of what had happened to the Hartmans and then been silenced before they could report it. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the secrets it contained, by the terrible knowledge that someone had killed the Hartman family and hidden their remains in the basement, then killed every subsequent family that had discovered the truth. The freezer lid slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot, and Sarah heard footsteps on the basement stairs behind her. But these weren't the soft, careful footsteps she had heard in the hallway outside her bedroom. These were heavy, purposeful, the footsteps of someone who was no longer concerned with stealth. Sarah turned around and saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs. Someone she didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar in a way she couldn't identify. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd and be immediately forgotten. but his eyes held a coldness that made Sarah's skin crawl, the flat, emotionless gaze of someone who had killed before and would kill again. Asterisk. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, his voice calm and conversational. "None of you ever should have come down here. But you always do, eventually. You find the photographs, you start asking questions, and then you have to see for yourself." Sarah realized that this was the person who had been entering her house, who had been manipulating her environment, who had been watching and waiting for her to discover the truth. About 1247 Maple Grove Lane. He wasn't a ghost or a supernatural presence. He was something much worse, a human being who had been killing families for decades, using the house as his hunting ground and the basement as his trophy room. The Morrisons figured it out too, the man continued, stepping closer to Sarah, who found herself pressed against the chest freezer with nowhere to retreat. "Linda found the photographs first, just like you did. David wanted to call the police, but I couldn't let that happen. They're in the freezer now, along with all the others. Along with the Hartmans and the Kowalskis and the Brennans and everyone else who got too curious about their new home." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape, but the man was standing between her and the stairs, and there was no other exit from the basement. She thought about the camera she had set up, wondered if it was recording this conversation, wondered if it would matter if no one ever found the footage. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I won't tell anyone what I've seen. I'll move out of the house. I'll never come back. I just want to leave." The man smiled, but it was the same strained, unnatural smile she had seen in all the photographs. "That's what they all say," he told her, "but I can't take that risk. This house is perfect for what I do. Isolated, but not suspicious, with neighbors who mind their own business and a basement that stays nice and cold. I've been using it for almost 40 years, and I plan to keep using it for 40 more. Sarah understood now why the house had changed hands so frequently, why the turnover rate had been so high. The man had been systematically murdering every family that moved in, probably selling the house himself under different identities, then waiting for the next unsuspecting buyers to take possession of their new home. It was an almost perfect system, one that had allowed him to kill dozens of people without ever arousing serious suspicion. But Sarah also realized that his system depended on isolation, on victims who had no close ties to the community, no one who would immediately notice their disappearance. And Sarah had been calling her sister regularly, had been in touch with her divorce lawyer, had contacted the police multiple times. Her disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed the way the other families had. "My sister knows where I am," she said, trying to buy time, trying to think of something that might save her life. "She's expecting me to call her tomorrow. If I don't, she'll come looking for me." The man's smile widened. "Then I guess I'll have to take care of your sister too," he said, "and anyone else who comes around asking questions. It's amazing how many people can disappear before anyone thinks to connect their deaths to a single location." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for what was about to happen. But then she heard something that filled her with hope. The sound of sirens approaching the house, multiple vehicles moving fast through the quiet suburban streets. She opened her eyes and saw confusion and concern flash across the man's face. "I set up more than just a camera," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "I installed a panic button connected directly to the police department. I pressed it as soon as you started talking. It was a lie, but it was a convincing one, and it created just enough doubt in the man's mind to make him hesitate." The sirens were getting closer, and Sarah could see him calculating whether he had time to kill her and escape before the police arrived. Asterisk. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She threw herself sideways, away from the chest freezer, and toward a pile of old paint cans stacked near the water heater. The man lunged after her, but his foot caught on something in the darkness, and he stumbled. Sarah grabbed the heaviest paint can she could find and swung it with all her strength, connecting with the side of his head and sending him crashing into the concrete wall. The man didn't get up. Sarah ran up the basement stairs and out of the house, not stopping until she was standing in the middle of Maple Grove Lane, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. The sirens she had heard turned out to belong to fire trucks responding to a call 3 blocks away. But her screaming brought neighbors out of their houses, including Harold Brennan, who took one look at Sarah's terrified face and immediately called 911. This time, when the police arrived, they found everything exactly as Sarah described it. The man in the basement was unconscious but alive, and a search of his pockets revealed identification documents from multiple identities, keys to several other properties, and a detailed notebook containing what appeared to be records of his crimes dating back to 1987. The chest freezer contained not just the remains of the Hartman family, but the bodies of at least 20 other people, all of them carefully preserved and organized like specimens in a collection. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of what had been happening at 1247 Maple Grove Lane and at several other properties the man had used for similar purposes. He had been operating for more than 3 decades, moving from state to state, always finding isolated houses that he could use as hunting grounds for his twisted hobby. The final count of his victims would exceed 50 people, entire families, who had simply vanished from the world without anyone understanding what had happened to them. Sarah survived, but the experience changed her in ways that would never fully heal. She moved back to San Francisco, back to the life she had tried to escape, and found that the problems that had once seemed insurmountable were nothing compared to what she had endured in that suburban house. She continued to have nightmares about the basement, about the photographs, about the man who had turned murder into a methodical business spanning decades. But she also knew that her survival had brought justice for all the families who had died in that house, all the people whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Lane was eventually demolished, the lot left empty as a small memorial to the victims. Harold Brennan made sure that a plaque was installed, listing the names of everyone who had died there, ensuring that they would be remembered even though the house that had claimed their lives was gone. And sometimes, late at night when Sarah couldn't sleep, she would think about all the other houses in all the other suburbs, places where families go to start new lives and find safety and peace. She would wonder how many of those houses hold secrets, how many of those perfect neighborhoods conceal the kind of darkness she had discovered on Maple Grove Lane. The thought terrified her, but it also reminded her that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, hiding in the most unremarkable places, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The man who had turned that house into a killing ground was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but he never revealed the locations of his other properties or provided information about victims that the police hadn't yet discovered. He simply sat in his cell, smiling that same strange smile from the photographs, taking his secrets with him into whatever darkness awaited him. And somewhere out there, Sarah knew there were other houses like 1247 Maple Grove Lane, other basements, with their own terrible secrets, other families who might discover photographs and footsteps and freezers, full of evidence that would change their lives forever. The suburbs looked so safe from the outside, so normal and peaceful, but Sarah had learned that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who hide in plain sight, who choose victims not based on any personal connection or vendetta, but simply because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case made national headlines for a few weeks before fading from public attention, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent horrors. But for the people who lived in Millbrook Heights, for Harold Brennan and Mrs. Vasquez, and all the other neighbors who had watched families come and go from 1247 Maple Grove Lane without ever understanding why, the revelation of what had been happening in their midst would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They began to question everything they thought they knew about their community, about the people who lived beside them, about the safety they had assumed came with suburban life. Harold would later tell reporters that he wished he had been more suspicious, more willing to investigate the strange patterns he had observed over the years. Mrs. Vasquez admitted that she had always felt something was wrong with that house, but had convinced herself it was just her imagination. The guilt was almost unbearable for some of them. They had been living their normal lives, worrying about property values and homeowners association meetings and lawn care, while just a few hundred feet away, families were being systematically murdered and stored in a basement freezer like products. In a warehouse, the knowledge that they could have prevented so many deaths if only they had been more observant, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions, would follow them into their dreams and their waking hours for years to come. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case was how easily it had gone undetected for so long. The killer had relied on the fundamental isolation of suburban life, the way that neighbors could live side by side for years without really knowing each other, without understanding the rhythms and patterns of each other's daily existence. He had counted on people minding their own business, on the assumption that what happened behind closed doors was private and not subject to community scrutiny. And his system had worked perfectly for decades, claiming victim after victim, until Sarah Chun happened to be curious enough and persistent enough to keep investigating, even when the evidence disappeared, even when the police dismissed her concerns, even when every rational voice told her to let the matter go. Her survival had been a matter of pure chance, a confluence of circumstances that could easily have gone the other way. The psychological evaluation that was conducted on the killer after his arrest revealed a man who felt no remorse for his crimes, no connection to his victims as human beings, no understanding of the suffering he had caused. He described his murders in the same tone that someone might use to discuss a hobby or a business venture, with attention to efficiency and methodology, but no emotional investment in the outcomes. The families he had killed were nothing more to him than raw materials for his collection, objects to be acquired and preserved, and displayed in his private museum of death. This emotional emptiness was perhaps more terrifying than any supernatural horror could ever be, because it represented a kind of evil that was entirely human, entirely rational within its own twisted logic. The killer hadn't been driven by passion or revenge, or even sadistic pleasure. He had simply found something that satisfied him, something that gave structure and meaning to his existence, and had pursued it with the same dedication that other people might bring to careers or relationships or artistic endeavors. In her victim impact statement, which Sarah delivered to the court during the sentencing hearing, she spoke about the ways that the experience had changed her understanding of safety and trust in community. She described the hypervigilance that now characterized her daily life, the way she found herself studying the faces of strangers and wondering what secrets they might be hiding, what darkness might lurk behind their ordinary exteriors. But she also spoke about the importance of paying attention, of trusting instincts even when they seemed irrational, of being willing to investigate when something felt wrong, even if the evidence was ambiguous or incomplete. She urged people to look out for their neighbors, to notice when patterns seemed unusual, to ask questions when families suddenly disappeared without explanation. The most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like everyone else, Sarah told the packed courtroom. They're the ones who blend in, who seem normal, who count on our willingness to mind our own business and assume that everything is fine. They rely on our reluctance to get involved, our fear of seeming paranoid or intrusive. But sometimes being paranoid can save lives. Sometimes getting involved is exactly what needs to happen. The judge sentenced the killer to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, calling the crimes an affront to human decency, and noting that the systematic nature of the murders demonstrated a level of planning and premeditation that warranted the harshest possible punishment. But even as justice was served, Sarah knew that the real damage could never be fully repaired. The families were gone, their lives cut short by someone who had seen them as nothing more than objects to collect. In the months that followed the trial, Sarah began working with victim advocacy groups and law enforcement agencies to help them understand the warning signs that might indicate when someone has become the target of a serial killer. She spoke at conferences and training sessions, sharing her story and helping others recognize the patterns that she had initially dismissed as products of stress or imagination. She learned that cases like hers were more common than most people, realized that suburban communities across the country harbored similar secrets, similar predators who had learned to exploit the assumptions and blind spots that came with middle-class life. The isolation that people sought when they moved to quiet neighborhoods, the privacy that seemed so appealing after the chaos of urban living, could also provide perfect cover for those who meant harm. But Sarah also discovered something unexpected. In her work with other survivors and law enforcement professionals, a community of people who understood the particular kind of trauma that came from discovering that your safe space had never been safe at all, that the life you had been building was constructed on a foundation of lies and hidden violence. These were people who had learned to live with the knowledge that evil could wear any face, could inhabit any space, could lurk behind any door. They were people who had survived encounters with the kind of darkness that most people never imagined existed in their own neighborhoods, and who had found ways to keep living despite that knowledge. They had learned to trust their instincts, to pay attention to details that others might dismiss, to take action when something felt wrong, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what that something was. And slowly, gradually, Sarah began to understand that her experience at 1247 Maple Grove Lane, as traumatic and life-altering as it had been, had also given her something valuable: the ability to see clearly, to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself, to help others avoid a kind of trap that she had barely escaped. Her survival hadn't been just a matter of luck. It had been a responsibility, an opportunity to use her experience to protect other people who might find themselves in similar situations. The house where it all happened remained an empty lot for several years after the demolition, a square of grass and weeds that stood out among the identical suburban homes, like a missing tooth in a smile. Children would dare each other to walk across the property at night, and teenagers would tell stories about the families who had died there, usually getting the details wrong but preserving the essential truth that something terrible had happened in that place. Eventually, the lot was sold to a developer who built a new house on the site, a structure that bore no resemblance to the original 1247 Maple Grove Lane. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children, people who had heard rumors about the property's history but had decided that the past couldn't hurt them, that they could create new memories to replace the old ones. Sarah wondered about them sometimes, wondered whether they felt any lingering presence from what had happened there, whether they had found any remnants that had been missed during the investigation and cleanup. She hoped they would be happy there, that they would fill the space with laughter and love and the ordinary chaos of family life. But she also hoped they would stay alert, would pay attention to their instincts, would remember that safety was never guaranteed, and that vigilance was the price of survival in a world where monsters wore human faces. The killer himself remained in prison, spending his days in solitary confinement and his nights, presumably, replaying the memories of his crimes. He received letters from true crime enthusiasts and amateur psychologists, people who were fascinated by the methodical nature of his murders and wanted to understand his motivations. But he rarely responded to these communications, apparently content to let his actions speak for themselves. Occasionally, investigators would visit him to ask about other unsolved cases, other missing families that might have fallen victim to his decades-long killing spree. But he provided no information, no closure for the families who were still searching for answers about their missing loved ones. His silence was a final act of cruelty, a way of ensuring that his victims remained lost forever, that their stories would never be fully told. And so the case of 1247 Maple Grove Lane became another chapter in the long history of human evil. Another reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who hide in plain sight, who choose their victims. Not from personal animosity, but from cold calculation and opportunity. It became a cautionary tale about the importance of community awareness, about the need to look out for neighbors and strangers alike, about the responsibility that comes with living in close proximity to other human beings. But it also became something else, a testament to the power of individual courage, to the importance of trusting instincts even when evidence is scarce, to the possibility of survival even in the face of overwhelming evil. Sarah's story became a beacon of hope for other people who had found themselves in impossible situations, who had discovered that the world contained more darkness than they had ever imagined, but who had also learned that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. As you listen to this story tonight, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your location, take a moment to consider the spaces around you, the people who share your community, the rhythms and patterns that define your daily life. Pay attention to what feels normal and what doesn't, to who belongs and who seems out of place, to the small details that your instincts might be trying to tell you are important. Remember that the suburbs look peaceful from the outside, that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, that the greatest dangers are sometimes the ones that hide behind closed doors and smiling facades. But also remember that awareness is protection, that community is strength, that ordinary people like Sarah Chun can survive extraordinary encounters with darkness and use their experience to help others avoid similar fates. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Lane is gone now, demolished and replaced, but the lessons it taught remain. Stay alert, trust your instincts, look out for your neighbors, and never assume that safety is guaranteed simply because a place looks normal or peaceful. The most important thing you can do is pay attention to the world around you, because you never know when that attention might save your life or someone else's. And as you settle into sleep tonight, remember that Sarah Chun's story had a different ending than those of the dozens of families who came before her, not because she was braver or smarter or more deserving of survival, but because she was willing to keep investigating even when the evidence disappeared, even when everyone told her to let it go, even when the rational thing would have been to ignore her instincts and accept that she was imagining things. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is refuse to let the mystery go unsolved, refuse to accept that strange things are just coincidences, refuse to dismiss your own observations as products of stress or imagination. Sometimes the difference between life and death is simply the willingness to keep asking questions when everyone else has decided that there are no more questions to ask. This has been Crime Stories for Sleep. Thank you for listening, and remember to trust your instincts, pay attention to your surroundings, and never take your safety for granted. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful and free from the darkness that hides in the most ordinary places.